Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time to one of the most peculiar and frankly baffling moments in economic history. We're going to talk about a flower, a simple, beautiful flower that for a brief, incandescent period became more valuable than a house, more sought after than gold, and powerful enough to bring a global economic superpower to its knees. We're going to talk about Tulip Mania. But this isn't just a story about a flower, or even about money. It's a story about us. It's a tale of human desire, of crowd psychology, and the incredible, almost comical, resilience of people who get swept up in something far bigger than themselves. Before we dive into the sheer madness of it all, I'd love it if you could take a moment to hit that like button, and maybe subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. It genuinely helps this little corner of the internet grow. And as always, I love seeing where you're all listening from. It's amazing to think of us all, scattered across the globe in different time zones, settling in for the same story. So drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, let's get comfortable. Dim the lights, pull up the covers, maybe find that perfect cool spot on your pillow. Let the day's worries dissolve. There's nothing you need to do now but listen, let your mind relax, and let's travel together back to the 17th century, to a place of incredible ingenuity, wealth, and impending absurdity. Chapter 1. The Dutch Golden Age, a crucible for speculation. To truly understand how a nation of supposedly sober, God-fearing and hard-working people could collectively lose their minds over a garden bulb, we first have to understand the world they built. We need to go to the Dutch Republic in the early 1600s, and we need to understand that this wasn't just any country. It was, for a time, the country. It was the Silicon Valley, the Wall Street, and the global shipping hub of its day, all rolled into one tiny waterlogged strip of land on the North Sea. First, you have to picture the landscape itself. The Netherlands is a place that by all logical accounts probably shouldn't exist. Much of it is land wrestled, inch by painstaking inch from the sea. It's a country built on defiance. For centuries, the Dutch had been locked in a constant grinding battle with the water. The sea was their greatest enemy, and their greatest friend. It was always trying to reclaim their living rooms to swallow their fields, but it was also their highway to the rest of the world. This endless struggle forged a particular kind of person, pragmatic, incredibly industrious, and with a profound belief in the power of human ingenuity to tame nature. They built dikes, canals, and windmills, not as charming pastoral decorations, but as instruments of survival. The iconic windmill wasn't just for grinding grain. It was a pump, a tireless machine working day and night to keep the nation's feet dry. This spirit of collective engineering, of working together against a common, relentless foe, created a society that was uniquely cooperative and organized. They had to be. If your neighbor's dike failed, your farm was next. This mentality would prove crucial when they started applying it, not just to water management, but to global trade. Politically, they were also an anomaly. While the rest of Europe was dominated by powerful absolute monarchies, kings and emperors who ruled by divine right, the Dutch Republic was, well, a republic. It was a federation of provinces governed by a wealthy class of merchants, traders, and financiers. They weren't aristocrats with ancient bloodlines. They were burghers, city dwellers, men who had made their fortunes through hard work, shrewd negotiation, and a healthy appetite for risk. Power in the Netherlands didn't come from a title granted by a king. It came from the weight of the gold in your purse and the number of ships you had sailing to the far corners of the earth. This created a social atmosphere that was startlingly modern. There was a degree of social mobility that was unthinkable in neighbouring France or Spain. If you were clever and ambitious, you could climb the ladder. This wasn't a society obsessed with birthright. It was obsessed with success. And success was measured in guilders. And were there guilders. The Dutch Republic in the early 17th century was experiencing an economic boom of unprecedented scale. It was their golden age. The city of Amsterdam became the heart of the global economy, the bustling, throbbing centre of a trade network that spanned the globe. Dutch ships called flutes were the cargo trucks of the era. They were cheap to build, required small crews, and could carry immense amounts of cargo. They dominated the seas, carrying timber from the Baltics, wine from France, wool from England, and most importantly, spices from the exotic East Indies. This is where the story of Dutch wealth really ignites. At the dawn of the 17th century, in 1602, a group of Dutch merchants did something revolutionary. They pooled their resources to fund unimaginably long and risky voyages to Asia and formed the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or the VOC. We know it as the Dutch East India Company. Calling the VOC a company is a bit like calling a blue whale a fish. It's technically true, but misses the scale of the thing entirely. The VOC was the world's first multinational corporation, and it was a corporate entity with the powers of a state. It could mint its own coins, negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, establish colonies, raise its own armies, and wage its own wars. Imagine a modern tech giant, but with its own navy and the legal authority to conquer territory. For nearly 2 centuries, the VOC was the driving force of Dutch commerce, a juggernaut that monopolized the incredibly lucrative spice trade. For us, spices are a common sight in any supermarket aisle. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. They're nice to have, but they don't exactly inspire awe. In the 17th century, these were the equivalent of microchips, pharmaceuticals, and rare earth minerals all rolled into one. They came from a handful of tiny islands in what is now Indonesia, thousands of miles, and a treacherous year-long voyage away. Nutmeg, in particular, was worth more than its weight in gold. It was believed to ward off the plague, a fear that was never far from the 17th century mind. The profits were astronomical. A single successful voyage could generate returns of 400%, sometimes even more. The wealth that flowed back into Amsterdam from the VOC's activities was like a tidal wave of money, transforming the city and the nation. This new, staggering wealth had to go somewhere, and it fundamentally changed the character of Dutch society. The Netherlands was built on a foundation of Calvinist Protestantism, a religion that preached sobriety, modesty, and hard work. Frivolity was frowned upon. Conspicuous displays of wealth were seen as sinful, yet here they were, a society of people who were, by their own religious logic, supposed to be humble, suddenly becoming preposterously rich. This created a fascinating psychological tension. How do you square your belief in modest living with the fact that you now own a warehouse full of nutmeg that's worth more than a nobleman's entire estate? The Dutch merchants found a remarkably convenient answer. They concluded that their wealth was a sign of God's divine favor. Their success wasn't a moral failing. It was a reward for their piety and diligence. This neat piece of mental gymnastics gave them the green light to enjoy their newfound riches, albeit in a particular tasteful way. They didn't start dripping in gold chains and building gaudy palaces like some other European elites. Their displays of wealth were more subtle, more bourgeois. They built tall, narrow, elegant brick houses along the newly dug canals of Amsterdam. These houses were a public ledger of their success. The more windows you had, the more tax you paid. So a wide facade with many windows was a quiet, respectable boast. Inside, they filled these homes with a testament to their global reach. Fine porcelain from China, intricate carpets from Persia, furniture made from exotic woods, and they commissioned art. This was the era of the Dutch masters, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals. But these artists weren't painting epic religious scenes or flattering portraits of kings. They were painting the people who paid the bills, stern-faced merchants, their wives in starched white collars, lively tavern scenes, luminous still lifes of a half-peeled lemon, and a gleaming silver platter. These paintings were a celebration of their world, of their domestic lives, and their material success. A painting wasn't just a decoration, it was an asset, an investment, a way to store and display wealth that was both beautiful and, they hoped, permanent. This burgeoning art market was a symptom of a much larger phenomenon. The Dutch were becoming comfortable with the idea of investing in things for both pleasure and profit. A beautiful painting could enrich your soul, but it could also be sold for more than you paid for it in a few years. This mindset is critical. They were learning to see value in objects that went beyond their simple utility. And all of this frantic economic activity was centered in one revolutionary place, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Established in 1602, the very same year as the VOC, it was the first institution of its kind in the world. Housed in a large courtyard, open to the often damp Dutch sky, men from all walks of life gathered to trade. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly transformative. Before this, wealth was primarily tangible. It was land, It was gold coin. It was a herd of cattle. The Amsterdam Exchange introduced and normalized a breathtaking new level of abstraction. Here you could buy a piece of the VOC without ever setting foot on a ship or smelling a clove. You could buy a share, a fraction of ownership in an enterprise happening on the other side of the planet. Your fortune was no longer tied to something you could hold in your hand, but to a piece of paper, to a number chalked on a board, to the collective belief of other traders in the future success of a venture. This was a profound mental leap. It decoupled wealth from physical reality. And the Dutch, with their pragmatic and innovative minds, didn't stop there. They invented or perfected a whole host of financial instruments that are still the bedrock of our markets today. They pioneered futures contracts, where you could agree to buy a commodity, like grain or herring, at a set price on a future date. This was originally a way for merchants to hedge against risk, to lock in a price and bring some predictability to the volatile world of trade. But it didn't take long for people to realize you could also use these contracts to speculate. You could buy a futures contract for grain, not because you needed grain, but because you believed the price of grain would go up. Then you could sell the contract to someone else before the delivery date and pocket the difference without a single bushel of wheat ever touching your hands. They traded in options, giving you the right but not the obligation to buy or sell a share at a certain price. They even engaged in short selling, selling shares they didn't yet own, betting that the price would fall so they could buy them back cheaper later. If you're feeling a bit sleepy just hearing about these financial products, that's perfectly fine. The details aren't what's important. What's important is the atmosphere it created. A whole new universe of making money had opened up, one that seemed almost like magic. It wasn't about toiling in a field or crafting something with your hands. It was about information, about nerve, about anticipating what other people would do. It introduced a kind of high-stakes intellectual game into the heart of the economy. And it wasn't just for the super-rich. While the big VOT merchants were the whales of this new ocean, the exchange democratized speculation to a degree. Shopkeepers, artisans, even household servants could pool their savings, buy a share or a part of a share, and feel the thrill of being part of this great engine of fortune. A new kind of conversation began to dominate the taverns and coffee houses. Not just of shipping news and crop prices, but of the fluctuating value of VOT shares, of rumours that could make or break a man's fortune overnight. A kind of low-grade speculative fever became a permanent feature of the cultural climate. The idea that you could get rich, and get rich quickly without the traditional slog of hard labour, was intoxicating. It was a powerful new drug, and the entire society was developing a taste for it. So let's pause and take a snapshot of the Dutch Republic in, say, the 1620s or early 1630s, just before our story truly begins. We have a society that is brimming with confidence. They have successfully fought off the Spanish Empire to win their independence. They have tamed the sea. They have built the most powerful trading empire and the most advanced economy on the planet. They are swimming in new money, cash that has come so fast, they are still figuring out what to do with it. We have a new, powerful merchant class that has replaced the old aristocracy. These are self-made men, intensely competitive, and eager to display their newfound status. But their traditional Calvinist values still linger, creating a strange mix of piety and materialism. They look for status symbols that are unique, sophisticated, and if possible, also a good investment. And crucially, we have a financial system that has normalized the act of speculation. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange has taught an entire populace to be comfortable with the idea of trading in abstract value, of betting on the future, of buying and selling things they will never actually see or touch. They have the means, with their piles of cash. They have the motive, with their desire for status. And they have the mechanism, a sophisticated market that can turn almost anything into a tradable commodity. The stage is perfectly set. The theatre is built. The audience is seated, buzzing with anticipation and holding fat wallets. All that's missing is the star of the show. All that's missing is something new, something exotic, something beautiful and rare, an object so captivating that it could become the ultimate focus of all this pent-up economic energy, social ambition and speculative desire. The crucible is hot, and into this bubbling, volatile mixture, a new arrival from the east is about to be dropped. A flower, recently imported from the Ottoman Empire, with brilliantly coloured petals, unlike anything the Dutch had ever seen before. It was delicate, it was beautiful, and for a time, it was fantastically rare. It was the tulip, and it was about to drive the Dutch completely, beautifully, and ruinously mad. But that is a story for our next chapter. For now, just rest. Imagine the cool, damp air of Amsterdam, the quiet lapping of water in the canals, the distant chime of a city clock marking the hour. Picture the tall, narrow houses, their windows glowing with candlelight, inside which a nation of successful, confident, and perhaps slightly bored merchants is dreaming of the next big thing. They don't know it yet, but it's already growing in their gardens. Chapter 2. The Botany of Desire, the tulip's journey to Holland. And what a strange and remarkable thing it was, this future obsession, growing quietly in the dark Dutch soil, before it was a number on a ledger, before it was a futures contract, or the cause of a tavern brawl. It was just a plant, a living thing. But it wasn't just any plant. It was an immigrant, a traveller with a long and storied past, a history steeped in a kind of reverence that the practical Dutch were only just beginning to understand. To truly grasp the madness that is to come, we have to go back. We have to leave the damp, orderly canals of Holland and travel east, far east, to a place of wind-scoured mountains and high, lonely steppes. The tulip did not begin its life in a pampered garden. Its ancestors were wild things, born of the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Central Asia. Picture the foothills of the Himalayas, the Tian Shan Mountains. This is the tulip's homeland. Here it was not a delicate treasure, but a hardy survivor. A splash of defiant colour, usually a simple, elegant red or yellow, pushing its way through the rocky soil after a long, brutal winter. It was a sign of life, a promise of spring, in a place that didn't offer many promises. Local tribes would have noticed it, perhaps even admired it, but it was just part of the landscape, like a stubborn goat or a particular configuration of clouds. It wasn't an investment, it was just there. But this humble mountain flower was destined for greatness. Its journey from obscurity began when it was noticed by the Seljuk Turks, nomadic peoples who were slowly migrating westward. They saw this simple, beautiful flower, and they took it with them, a living souvenir of their homeland. And as they travelled, conquered, and eventually settled, building one of the world's great empires, the tulip travelled with them. It found its way into the gardens of Persia, where it was celebrated in poetry and art. Its cup-like shape, seen as a symbol of a lover's heart, set aflame with passion. The great poet Rumi would write of it. It was becoming more than a flower, it was becoming a symbol. Its true ascension, however, came when it reached the heart of the Ottoman Empire, in what is now modern-day Turkey. Here, in the sprawling, opulent courts of Constantinople, the tulip didn't just find a home, it found a throne. The sultans, particularly Suleiman the Magnificent, didn't just like tulips. They engaged in what we might politely call a full-blown floral obsession. For the Ottomans, the tulip was practically divine. In the Arabic script of the time, the word for tulip, lale, was written with the same letters as the word for God, Allah. This was not a coincidence. They were prepared to ignore. The flower became a sacred symbol, a representation of the divine on earth. And so they cultivated it with a fervour that bordered on worship. The gardens of the Topkapi Palace became a living museum of tulip varieties. They held festivals, the tulip era, where the entire court would gather at night in gardens lit by lanterns and mirrors, with caged nightingales providing the soundtrack, just to gaze upon the most perfect blossoms. Owning a rare and beautiful tulip was not just a sign of wealth, it was a sign of piety, of closeness to the divine, of impeccable taste. They gave the new varieties names that dripped with poetry: Light of Paradise, Matchless Pearl, Rose of the Dawn. This wasn't botany, it was a romance. The tulip wasn't just a plant, it was a silent courtier, an object of intense, almost spiritual desire. And it was here, in these fiercely protected imperial gardens, that the flower began to change. Now we need to talk about the practicalities of a tulip, because this is where the seeds of the future mania are sown. You see, a tulip is a patient person's game. If you are a 17th century botanist, or just a very wealthy person with a garden, you have two ways to make more tulips. The first is to plant a seed from a pollinated flower. This is the way of nature. the way to get new, exciting genetic variations. The only slight drawback is that it takes on average 7 years for a tulip seed to grow into a bulb, mature enough to produce a single flower. 7 years. Just let that sink in for a moment. In our world of instant gratification, of overnight shipping, and on-demand everything, imagine dedicating a patch of your garden to something you won't see the result of for nearly a decade. You could raise a child to elementary school age in that time. It was a staggering investment of time, land, and hope. You were planting a prayer and waiting for an answer. The second method is much faster. A mature tulip bulb, after its flower has withered, will often produce 1 or 2 smaller clonal offshoots at its base. These are called bulblets or offsets. You can carefully separate these from the mother bulb and plant them. These will grow into a flowering bulb in just a year or 2. Much better, right? The catch is that these bulblets are exact genetic copies of the parent. If you have a simple plain red tulip, you will only ever get more simple plain red tulips from its offshoots. It's reliable, it's predictable, and for a market about to go insane, it was profoundly boring. The real money, the real prestige was in novelty. Everyone wanted a flower that no one else had ever seen before, and the only way to get true novelty was through the 7-year gamble of growing from seed. So we have an object of desire that is, by its very nature, incredibly slow to create, and even slower to diversify. Scarcity was literally built into its DNA. But then, something else started happening. Something strange, unpredictable, and breathtakingly beautiful. In the midst of all these solid-coloured tulips, the reds, the yellows, the whites, a flower would occasionally bloom with a pattern that seemed impossible. It would have feathered edges of a contrasting colour, or intricate flame-like streaks, called flames or flashes, licking up the sides of its petals. These were known as broken tulips, and they were the most desirable things on earth. A solid yellow tulip might be lovely, but a tulip of the deepest violet with delicate white feathers tracing every petal's edge, or a creamy white flower with jagged streaks of crimson fire erupting from its base. This was not just botany, this was art, this was magic. The Ottomans, and later the Dutch, had no earthly idea what caused this. They thought it was something in the soil, or the result of a specific cross-pollination, or perhaps even a direct touch from God, a sign of divine favour, bestowing a unique masterpiece upon a worthy gardener. They tried everything to replicate it. They would plant different coloured bulbs next to each other, hoping the colours would bleed over in the soil. They would try different types of soil, different fertilisers, all manner of horticultural alchemy, but it was useless. The breaking was utterly random. A gardener could have a bed of 1,000 identical solid-coloured tulips, and one spring, a single one might just break. It was a miracle, a winning lottery ticket, and because no one knew how to create it, a broken tulip was the very definition of priceless. You couldn't make one on purpose, you could only hope to own one, and then pray that its bulb would produce a few clonal offshoots the next year, so you could have a few more of your miraculous flower. Of course, we know now what was happening. The beautiful, mysterious breaking was not an act of God, it was a disease. Specifically, it was the result of a virus, the mosaic virus, which was spread by aphids, little green flies that would feed on one tulip and then carry the infection to another. The virus would interfere with the bulb's colour coding, causing the top layer of pigment to be suppressed in patches, revealing the base colour underneath. That beautiful crimson flame on a white petal, that was the sign of a sickness. A beautiful, beautiful sickness. There's a deep irony there, isn't there? The very thing that made the tulips most valuable was also a pathogen that over time weakened the bulb. A broken tulip bulb would be less vigorous, produce fewer offshoots, and eventually, after a few generations, it would wither and die. The virus was a talented, but ultimately destructive artist. It created fleeting masterpieces, and then destroyed its own canvas. This only added another layer of precarity and rarity to the whole affair. Your priceless flower was not just rare, it was mortal. It was living on borrowed time. So this is the object that is about to arrive in Europe. Not just a flower, it's a symbol of divine power from the most glamorous empire on earth. It's an object that requires an almost biblical patience to cultivate, and its most prized forms are the result of a mysterious, seemingly magical transformation that no one can control or replicate. It is the perfect storm of beauty, rarity, and mystery. Its arrival in Europe is, like most things in history, a little fuzzy, but we have a pretty good story. It centers on a man named Ogier de Busbecq. He was the ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor to the court of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1550s. While doing his ambassadorial duties, he, like everyone else, became enchanted by the tulips he saw in the palace gardens. He called them tulipan, a misunderstanding of the Turkish word for turban, tulbent, which the flowers were thought to resemble. The name stuck. Crucially, Busbecq didn't just admire them, he managed to acquire some bulbs and seeds and sent them back to Vienna. From there, the tulip began its quiet infiltration of European aristocratic gardens, but its leap from a curiosity for the rich to a full-blown obsession can be credited to one man, Carolus Clusius. Clusius was one of the greatest botanists of his age. He was a scientist, a collector, a man of immense intellect, and by all accounts a rather prickly and possessive personality. He was in charge of the Imperial Botanical Gardens in Vienna when Busbecq's tulips first arrived, and he was captivated. This was his life's work, to study, to categorize, to understand the natural world, and here was a plant of almost infinite variety and mystifying habits. When Clusius eventually took a new post in the Netherlands to create a botanical garden at the University of Leiden, he brought his precious tulip collection with him. Now, Clusius was an academic, not a merchant. He wasn't interested in selling his bulbs. He was interested in studying them. He would grow them, document their variations, and maybe, if you were a very important person or a close friend, he might give you one as a gift. For everyone else, the answer was a firm no. He was, in modern terms, the gatekeeper. He had the goods, and he wasn't sharing. You can imagine how this went down with the wealthy Dutch merchants and aristocrats. They had money, they had taste, and they had a burning desire to own the beautiful, exotic things they could see growing just over the wall in Clusius's garden. They'd offer him huge sums of money. He'd refuse. He saw them as vulgar commercialists, and they saw him as a selfish old hoarder. This tension between the obsessive collector and the desirous public could only end one way. History politely calls it the diffusion of Clusius's collection. What really happened is that people started stealing his tulips. These weren't violent, smash-and-grab robberies. They were quiet, late-night operations. Enthusiasts with late-night gardening ambitions would hop the wall of the botanical garden and carefully, expertly, dig up some of his most prized bulbs. It was an act of horticultural liberation. And through these thefts, the tulip escaped the ivory tower of academia and entered the Dutch marketplace. Clusius was, as you can imagine, absolutely furious. But it was too late. The bulbs were out. They were being propagated in the private gardens of the wealthy, their clonal offshoots being sold and traded among a small, elite circle of connoisseurs. Initially, these were the only people involved. The tulip trade in the late 16th and very early 17th century was a gentleman's hobby. It was like collecting fine art or rare books. A single rare bulb might be traded for a fine carriage or a few acres of land, but it was all done between wealthy individuals. They would publish illustrated catalogues of their collections, showing off their Viceroy or Semper Augustus tulips with immense pride. They were creating a culture of desire. They were establishing a universally agreed upon, if slightly unhinged, truth that this little onion-like object that you put in the dirt was a legitimate store of immense value. They were lovingly, carefully building the foundation of the madness. The flower had completed its long journey from the mountains of Kazakhstan, through the palaces of Constantinople, into the hands of a grumpy Dutch botanist, and finally into the gardens of the Dutch elite. All the pieces are now on the board. The object of desire is here. Its story, its beauty, its built-in scarcity, and its mysterious, sickly perfection have made it irresistible. And it has arrived in a nation that is uniquely primed for a speculative fever dream. A country awash with new money, a rising middle class with cash to spend, and a deep-seated cultural appreciation for both beauty and shrewd investment. The bulb is in the ground. The obsession has taken root, and now all it needs is for the rest of the country to notice what's growing just over the garden wall. For now, let the image settle in your mind. The quiet, orderly gardens of Leiden and Amsterdam. The dark, rich soil, cool to the touch, and buried within it, these little brown bulbs, each one a dormant promise, a tightly packed bundle of potential beauty and ruin. They are sleeping, and soon the whole country will be dreaming of them. Just rest. Chapter 3. From Garden to Tavern, the birth of a mass market and a dream, once it takes hold, is a difficult thing to keep contained within a garden wall. A dream has a way of seeping out, of whispering itself on the wind, of catching in the ear of someone who wasn't supposed to be listening. For all the careful cultivation by the wealthy connoisseurs, for all their Latin names and private catalogues, they made one critical oversight. They had staff, they had gardeners who tended the precious soil, servants who carried messages, delivery boys who carted bulbs from one grand canal house to another. And these people had ears. They heard the hushed, excited conversations. They saw the glint in their master's eyes. They saw a single small brown bulb exchanged for a sum that could buy their own family home outright. And what do you do with a piece of information like that? A piece of information so potent, so fundamentally world-altering. You don't keep it to yourself. That kind of secret is too heavy to carry alone. You take it with you at the end of the day, out of the manicured, orderly world of the patrician garden, and into the loud, chaotic, deeply human world of the public house. You take it to the tavern. Let's leave the quiet gardens behind for a moment. Let the image of neat rows and labelled flower beds dissolve. I want you to picture a very different place. Picture a room in Amsterdam or Haarlem, sometime around 1635. The ceiling is low, crisscrossed with heavy dark wooden beams that have been stained nearly black by decades of pipe smoke. The air is thick, a humid cocktail of tobacco, spilled beer, wet wool, and the faint greasy smell of fried fish from the kitchen. It's an atmosphere you could practically chew on. Light is a precious commodity here, provided by a few sputtering tallow candles and the low orange glow of a peat fire in a large hearth. It's a world of shadows and shifting shapes, where faces are illuminated for a moment and then retreat back into the gloom. This was the social media of the 17th century. It was the stock exchange, the newsroom, and the office water cooler, all rolled into one smoky, noisy package. This is where the real life of the city happened. In one corner you have sailors, their faces weathered from the North Sea winds, gambling away their wages with a deck of greasy cards. In another, a group of weavers, their fingers still stained with dye, are arguing loudly about guild politics. Merchants huddle at a small table, drawing up contracts by candlelight, while a baker, still dusted with a fine layer of flour, sips a frothy ale and tries to forget the pre-dawn chill of his bakery. This is the world the tulip is about to enter, and it will not enter politely. It will burst through the door like a drunken sailor, shouting about fortunes to be made. The whispers that began in the gardens become conversations here. The gardener tells his brother, the weaver, about the ridiculous price of a viceroy bulb. The weaver mentions it to his cousin, the fisherman, who tells his crew. The story spreads like a contagion, mutating and growing with each telling. The price doubles, then quadruples in the retelling. The one bulb becomes a dozen. The single house it could buy becomes an entire estate. Human nature, after all, has never let the facts get in the way of a truly spectacular story. And the story was intoxicating. For the vast majority of people in this tavern, life was a known quantity. It was hard work, with a predictable, modest reward. If you were a baker, you would likely die a baker. Your sons would be bakers. Your world was circumscribed by the heat of your oven and the price of grain. But this was different. The tulip wasn't about hard work. It wasn't about your station in life or the trade you had learned since you were a boy. It was a lottery ticket. It was a shimmering, beautiful shortcut to a life you had only ever dreamed of. It was a chance, just one chance, to leapfrog over the walls of your own existence. But there was a problem. A practical, logistical problem. Most of the people in this tavern, even if they pooled all their money together, couldn't afford one of the top-tier bulbs. And even if they could, the bulbs themselves were inconvenient. They spent most of the year planted in the ground, completely inaccessible. You couldn't just pop over to the market and buy a Semper Augustus like you were buying a cabbage. The trading season, when bulbs could be safely dug up and moved, was short, just a few months in the summer. This would have been the end of the story. The mania would have remained a hobby for the rich, but humanity, especially when there's a profit to be made, is remarkably inventive. If you can't trade the thing itself, you trade the idea of the thing. And so, in these smoky, beer-soaked rooms, a new kind of commerce was born, a practice the Dutch called windhandel, the wind trade. It sounds poetic, doesn't it? Windhandel. It literally means trading in wind, and that's precisely what it was. It was the buying and selling of ghosts. It was commerce based on promises, on pieces of paper, on a future that did not yet exist. What they were trading were, in essence, futures contracts. Let's slow down and walk through this, because it's the engine that will drive the entire mania into utter insanity. Imagine our baker, let's call him Jan. Jan has heard the stories. His neighbour, a cobbler, bought a simple bulb for 10 guilders in the autumn, and has just heard from a merchant that it's now worth 30. Jan feels a pang of that timeless universal emotion, the fear of missing out. He needs to get in on this. He goes to a tavern known for this new kind of trade. He finds a man, a minor merchant named Peter, who owns the rights to a decent tulip bulb, let's say a Gouda. The actual bulb is currently sleeping peacefully under 3 inches of frozen soil in a garden across town. It won't be ready to be dug up until June. It is now January. Jan cannot buy the bulb, but he can buy the promise of the bulb. So Peter pulls out a small piece of paper. On it, he writes a simple contract. It says something to the effect of, I, Peter, promise to deliver to the bearer of this note 1 healthy Gouda tulip bulb in June of this year, 1636. Jan agrees to buy this promise for, say, 50 Goudas. He doesn't give Peter the 50 Goudas right away. Maybe he gives him a small deposit, a wine money fee to seal the deal with a drink. The full amount is to be paid upon delivery in June. Jan now walks away from the table, not with a tulip bulb, but with a piece of paper. That scrap of paper represents 1 tulip bulb. It is a bulb ghost, a horticultural IOU. He feels the thrill of it. He is now a player in the game. But Jan isn't a flower enthusiast. He doesn't care about the delicate feathering on the petals or the particular shade of its crimson streaks. He is a speculator. 2 weeks later, the rumours are flying. The price of Goudas is on the rise. People are frantic to get them. Jan goes back to the tavern. He finds another man, a weaver named Willem, who is desperate to get into the market. Jan shows him the piece of paper. He says, I have the right to a Gouda bulb in June. The going rate is now 80 guilders. I will sell you this right, this piece of paper, for 75 guilders. Willem, seeing a bargain, agrees. He pays Jan the 75 guilders. Jan has just made 25 guilders, perhaps a month's wages for him, without ever seeing, touching or smelling a single flower. He sold wind, and he feels like a genius. Willem now holds the paper, confident that by the time June rolls around, it will be worth 100 guilders or more. The piece of paper is passed from hand to hand, its price climbing with each transaction, each new owner dreaming of the profit they will make. Meanwhile, what is the actual tulip bulb doing? Nothing. It's in the ground. It is completely blissfully unaware that its abstract value is causing such a commotion in a smoky tavern. It is a silent partner in this whole frantic enterprise. It has no idea that its name is being scribbled on scraps of paper, that its future beauty is being mortgaged again and again by men who wouldn't know a petal from a turnip. This is the absolute brilliance and the utter madness of windhandel. It detached the market from reality. The trade was no longer about the physical exchange of a rare flower. It was about the trade in paper promises. It allowed the market to operate 24/7 all year round, driven by nothing more than rumour, hope, and collective delusion. The volume of trade exploded. You didn't need a fortune to play anymore. You just needed a little cash for a deposit and a healthy dose of optimism. You didn't need a garden or horticultural knowledge. You just needed a seat in a tavern and the nerve to sign a piece of paper. And so the taverns transformed. They developed their own rituals, their own subcultures. Certain pubs in Haarlem and Amsterdam and Hoorn became known as the unofficial stock exchanges for tulips. To make the trades more official, groups of traders formed what they called colleges. This sounds far grander than it was. It wasn't a university. It was a group of guys who met in the back room of a pub, made up their own rules for trading, and usually spent a good portion of the profits on elaborate dinners and vast quantities of alcohol. The atmosphere at these colleges was less like a modern stock exchange, and more like a high-stakes poker game mixed with a fraternity party. Trades were often sealed with a round of drinks. A board would be hung on the wall, listing the latest prices for the most popular varieties. Runners would move between taverns, carrying news of price changes elsewhere in the city, the 17th century equivalent of a scrolling ticker tape. The social pressure was immense. Imagine you are that baker, Jan, again. You go to your local tavern for a quiet beer after a long day of work. But the room is buzzing. Your friends, your neighbours, the people you see every day, are all talking about one thing: tulips. They're passing around these little notes, these promises of flowers. They're talking in this new language of mortis, and they clap each other on the back, celebrating a successful sale. One man proudly announces he made 100 guilders in a single afternoon. That's more than you make in 3 months of back-breaking labour. You try to ignore it. It seems foolish, trading wind. But every day you see them getting richer. You see the cobbler buying a new, finer coat for his wife. You see the weaver talking about adding a new room to his house. And you look at your own hands, calloused and covered in flour. And you think, what am I doing wrong? Am I the fool for working so hard when a fortune can be made on a piece of paper? This is the psychology of a bubble. It's not just about greed. It's about the fear of being left behind. It's about the erosion of your own sense of reality. When everyone around you is participating in a shared delusion, it stops feeling like a delusion. It starts feeling like the new reality. Your skepticism, which once felt like prudence, now feels like cowardice. Your hard-earned money, sitting in a jar, feels not safe but stagnant, useless. And so people from every walk of life were drawn in. We have records of weavers, carpenters, bricklayers, and even chimney sweeps pooling their life savings to buy a single share in a high-end bulb. Farmers mortgaged their land. Merchants sold their stock. Artisans pawned their tools. They were all chasing the same dream, fueled by stories that became more incredible with each telling. The story of the orphanage in the city of HORDE that liquidated its assets, the land and property meant to care for the city's most vulnerable children, and invested it all in tulips, confident they could build a grander, more magnificent home with the profits. The story of the sailor who, mistaking a priceless bulb for an onion, casually ate it for lunch with his herring, only to be thrown in jail. True or not, these stories formed the mythology of the mania. They were the evidence, passed from person to person, that this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. The value was no longer connected to the flower. The names themselves, Admiral of Admirals, General of Generals, became a kind of currency. People were buying and selling names, not plants. They were trading in social status, in bragging rights. To own a note for a Semper Augustus was to own a piece of a legend. The piece of paper in your hand was a ticket to a more glamorous world. Let's just pause and rest in that tavern for a moment. Feel the claustrophobic warmth of the room. Hear the low murmur of dozens of conversations. The clinking of glasses. The scraping of chairs on the wooden floor. See the focused, almost feverish looks on the faces of the men, huddled around the tables, their worlds shrunk down to a single piece of paper, and the numbers written on it. Outside, the Dutch winter is in full force. The canals are frozen over, and a cold, damp wind is rattling the window shutters. Life for most people is hard, a daily struggle against the elements and for survival. But in here, in this bubble of warm, smoky air, there is hope. There is the promise of an everlasting summer, a future where hardship is a distant memory, all of it balanced on the promise of a flower bulb, sleeping in the cold, hard ground. The disconnect is staggering. An entire nation's economic energy, its hopes and fears, being channeled into a market for something that doesn't even technically exist yet. They were building castles in the air, trading in the wind, and for a little while, it seemed like those castles were real. It seemed like the wind could actually make you rich. And as more and more people rushed into the taverns, pushing the prices ever higher, it felt like the dream would never end. But dreams always do. For now, though, the party is just getting started. The tavern is full, the beer is flowing, and everyone is getting very, very rich on paper. Just rest in that thought, the dizzying, impossible, paper-thin promise of a fortune. Chapter 4. The Peak of Absurdity. A castle for a bulb. The dizzying, impossible, paper-thin promise of a fortune. Let's hold on to that thought for a moment. Let's feel the texture of it. It's not the heavy, reassuring weight of a gold coin in your palm. It's not the solid deed to a plot of land, the thick parchment with its wax seal. No, this new wealth was something else entirely. It was the rustle of a promissory note, a hastily scribbled IOU exchanged in the smoky, gin-soaked air of a tavern. It was a ghost of a transaction, a promise to deliver a flower bulb that was, at that very moment, fast asleep under a blanket of frozen Dutch soil. This was the infamous wind handle, the wind trade, and in the winter of 1636, the wind was blowing a gale-force hurricane of imaginary riches across the Netherlands. You see, the market had evolved, or perhaps devolved, past the point of trading actual physical things. In the early days, a buyer might hand over a few guilders and receive a small onion-like bulb in a cloth sack, simple, tangible. But as the prices began their climb into the stratosphere, a few practical problems emerged. Chief among them was the simple fact of botany. A tulip bulb, once planted in the autumn, cannot be safely dug up until the following summer. This created a rather inconvenient lull in the trading season, a long, cold winter where the assets were literally stuck in the ground. For a market running on pure, uncut speculative fever, this would not do. The trade couldn't simply stop for 6 months. The machine needed to keep running. And so, the wind trade was born. Instead of selling the bulb itself, sellers began to sell a contract, a piece of paper promising to deliver a specific bulb, say 1 Gouda bulb of a certain weight, come summertime. The buyer, in return, promised to pay the agreed-upon price at the time of delivery. In theory, it was a simple futures contract. In practice, it was pure alchemy. It untethered the price of a tulip from anything resembling reality. A piece of paper was so much easier to trade than a fragile, muddy bulb. It could be passed from hand to hand in a tavern, its price escalating with each exchange. A weaver could buy a contract for a bulb in the morning for 500 guilders and sell that same piece of paper to a baker before lunch for 600, having made 100 guilders, perhaps a third of his annual income, without ever seeing, touching, or even thinking about the actual flower. The bulb was irrelevant. The paper was the prize. This is where things truly enter the realm of the surreal. The taverns of cities like Haarlem and Amsterdam, once places for a quiet pipe and a beer after a long day's work, transformed, they became the world's first chaotic, unregulated stock exchanges. Historians call them colleges, which sounds far too sophisticated for what they were. Imagine a room, thick with the smell of stale beer, pipe smoke, and wet wool. The low ceilings trapped the noise, a constant hum of conversation, punctuated by the clatter of tankards and the sudden roar of a deal being struck. In one corner, a group of merchants, their faces flushed with wine and excitement, pass a note back and forth. In another, a tailor, his eyes wide with a mixture of greed and terror, signs away the deed to his workshop, leveraging his entire existence on the hope that the price of a Semper Augustus will double again by springtime. There were no rules in these colleges. It was a gentleman's agreement, which is a polite way of saying it was a system built entirely on collective belief. The only thing giving that piece of paper its value was the shared delusion that someone else would eventually buy it for more. It was a nationwide game of hot potato, except the potato was a piece of paper representing a dormant flower, and the stakes were your home, your business, your family's future. The very air seemed to crackle with this nervous energy. Every new entrant into the tavern was scrutinized. Was he a buyer? Did he have fresh money to pump into the system? Rumors spread like wildfire. A nobleman in The Hague just paid 3,000 guilders for a viceroy. The price in Haarlem must now be at least 3,200. And just like that, it was. The price was whatever the last person was foolish enough to pay. And oh, the prices they paid. This is where the story tips over from a curious financial bubble into something bordering on mass hysteria to understand the sheer breathtaking absurdity of the peak. In that cold winter of 1636 and early 1637, we have to talk about the gods of this new pantheon, the celebrity bulbs, the ones whose names were whispered with the same reverence one might reserve for a king or a famous general. At the absolute pinnacle, enthroned in myth and desire, was the Semper Augustus, the Emperor Augustus. Even its name was perfect. It was the unicorn of the tulip world. There were perhaps only a dozen or so bulbs in existence, and their owners were known throughout the country. To see one in bloom was an event. Imagine a flower of impossible purity, its petals a brilliant creamy white, as flawless as polished porcelain, and upon this perfect canvas, intricate crimson flames, feathered and streaked with breathtaking artistry, as if painted by the finest master. Each flower was unique, a masterpiece of nature's own chaotic design. We know now, of course, that this beautiful break in the colour was the result of a virus, the tulip breaking virus, which infected the bulb and, while creating these stunning patterns, also weakened it, making it difficult to propagate. This, paradoxically, only added to its allure. It was tragically, exquisitely beautiful. To own a Semper Augustus was not just to own a flower, it was to own something that no one else could have. It was the ultimate status symbol in a society obsessed with status, and its price reflected that. One account tells of a single bulb of Semper Augustus being sold for 10,000 guilders. Let's pause and try to wrap our modern minds around that number. 10,000 guilders. In the 1630s, a skilled craftsman, a master carpenter or a stonemason, might earn 300 guilders in a year if he was lucky and worked constantly. So, we are talking about more than 30 years of hard physical labour for a master craftsman. The average person, a common labourer or a farmhand, might earn half that. For them, it was a lifetime of toil, and then some. A prosperous merchant, living a very comfortable life, might have an annual income of around 1,000 guilders. 10,000 guilders could buy you a grand townhouse on one of Amsterdam's finest canals, complete with servants' quarters, a garden, and a stable. It could purchase a massive country estate with acres of farmland. It was a fortune. It was the kind of money that could elevate your family's status for generations, and it was being exchanged for one single dormant flower bulb. Imagine the transaction. A man who owns a magnificent house. Let's picture it. A tall, narrow brick facade with elegant gables, overlooking a serene canal, sunlight glinting off the leaded glass windows. Inside, it's filled with heavy oak furniture, fine tapestries, Delftware pottery. It represents security, comfort, a legacy, and he trades it all. He signs the deed, hands over the keys, and in return he is handed a small, dry, brownish object that looks a bit like an onion. He takes this thing home to his new, much smaller rented rooms, and he places it in a velvet-lined box. He has traded solid brick and mortar, a piece of the city itself, for an abstraction, for a promise of beauty that won't even reveal itself for another 6 months, assuming it doesn't rot, get eaten by a mouse, or simply fail to grow. His friends and family must have thought he was insane, but in the winter of 1636, he was considered a genius, a savvy investor who had just acquired the most sought-after asset on Earth. He hadn't bought a bulb, he had bought a piece of the future. This wasn't an isolated case. Another of the great aristocrats of the tulip world was a variety called the Viceroy. It lacked the mythical rarity of the Semper Augustus, but it was still a magnificent broken tulip, and its price tag was equally mind-boggling. There is a famous, almost certainly embellished, but nonetheless instructive story about a Viceroy bulb that perfectly captures the madness. The story involves a sailor, just returned from a long voyage. He's been at sea for months, maybe years, living on hardtack and salted fish. He steps onto the solid ground of Amsterdam, his pockets empty, but his heart full of the simple joys of being home. He's delivering a message to a wealthy merchant, one of the new tulip speculators. He enters the merchant's grand office. The merchant is busy, distracted, counting his paper profits. On the counter, among the ledgers and inkwells, sits an object that looks to the sailor, for all the world, like an onion. Now, you have to put yourself in the sailor's shoes. He's hungry. He's simple. He's just been paid for his delivery, and he's thinking about the fine Dutch herring he's going to buy. And what goes better with a herring than a nice sharp slice of onion? Seeing the bulb sitting there, looking neglected, he thinks he's doing the merchant a favour by tidying up. He pops it into his pocket. He goes down to the docks, buys his fish, sits on a barrel, and enjoys his lunch, crunching on the onion which, he probably noted, had a rather bland, un-onion-like flavour. Meanwhile, the merchant discovers his prized Viceroy bulb is missing. Panic ensues. The entire household is turned upside down. The search grows more and more frantic. Finally, suspicion falls upon the sailor, the only visitor of the morning. The merchant and his staff hunt him down and find him on the docks, just finishing his meal, wiping the last of the flakes from his lips. The merchant, apoplectic with rage, demands to know what he's done with the bulb. The sailor, confused, pulls the half-eaten remnant from his pocket. "This old onion?" he asks. The moment of realization is pure, tragic comedy. The merchant, it is said, nearly fainted. The sailor had just eaten the equivalent of a small fortune. To give him a sense of the crime he had unwittingly committed, the merchant supposedly drew up a bill of what that single bulb was worth. The list is a testament to the absurdity of the era. It included 2 lasts of wheat, 4 lasts of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat swine, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed with mattress and bedding, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup. All of that, a veritable feast, a dowry, enough to stock a farm and furnish a house, enough to live on for years, and the sailor had eaten it for lunch. He was, of course, thrown in prison. His mistake was not just theft, but a kind of blasphemy. He had failed to recognize the divinity of the object. He had treated a god like a common vegetable. Whether the story is precisely true or not, it was told and retold, becoming a parable for the times. It highlights the immense, almost comical, gap between the perceived value of these bulbs and their intrinsic worth. To 99% of the world, it was an onion. To the speculators in the tavern, it was a townhouse. The value wasn't in the object, it was in the shared belief system. The sailor was a heretic, an unbeliever, and he paid the price for his ignorance. And it wasn't just the top-tier bulbs. The madness trickled down, mid-range varieties with names like Gouda or Admiral van der Eyck were fetching prices equivalent to the cost of a fine carriage, a team of horses, or several acres of land. A single bulb of a variety called Switzers, not even one of the most celebrated, was recorded as selling for 1,500 guilders. A few months earlier, that same bulb might have sold for 60. People were leveraging everything they owned. Weavers sold their looms. Farmers mortgaged their land. Shopkeepers sold their inventory. They were all desperate to get into the game, terrified of being the only person in the neighborhood not getting rich. Imagine the social pressure. Your neighbor, a baker you've known your whole life, who you always considered a bit dim-witted, suddenly buys a new carriage, and his wife is wearing silks imported from Italy. You ask him how. "Tulips," he says with a knowing smile, as if it's the most obvious thing in the world. He tells you he bought a promissory note for a general bowl for 200 guilders, and sold it a week later for 500. He did nothing. He produced nothing. He simply signed a piece of paper, and then signed it over to someone else, and in the process made more money than he usually makes in a year of waking up at 3 a.m. to bake bread. You start to feel like a fool for toiling away at your own craft. Your work is hard, it's slow, it's predictable. This is like magic. This fear of being left behind is a powerful human emotion. It's the engine of every speculative bubble in history, and in the close-knit communities of the 17th century Netherlands, it was amplified. News travelled fast. Success was visible. When the blacksmith is suddenly drinking fine French wine and the cooper is talking about buying a small country home, the social fabric begins to strain. The old order, where a man's wealth was tied to his trade, his land or his inheritance, was being turned upside down. A new dizzying path to wealth had appeared, and it seemed to require nothing more than a bit of nerve and the price of entry. So people from all walks of life jumped in. It wasn't just the wealthy merchants. It was chimney sweeps, cobblers, maids, artisans. They scraped together their meagre savings. They borrowed from relatives. They sold their most precious possessions. They took all the security they had painstakingly built over a lifetime and tossed it into the roaring fire of the tulip market. They weren't buying flowers. They were buying hope. They were buying a ticket out of their station in life. They were buying the dream of becoming one of the gentlemen in the tavern. A man whose fortune was made not with his hands, but with a confident signature on a scrap of paper. Let's try to walk through one of these trades to feel the pull of it ourselves. Let's invent a man. We'll call him Peter. He's a sailmaker in Enkhuizen, a busy port town. He's good at his work. His hands are calloused and strong. He has a small house, a wife, a few children. He is by no means poor, but his life is one of careful calculation. Every guilder is accounted for. For months, Peter has heard the stories. He's heard them at the docks, in the market. He dismisses them as foolishness. He deals in tangible things, canvas, rope, tar, things you can see and touch. This tulip business is just smoke and mirrors, wind handle. But then, his own brother-in-law, a man who fishes for herring, a man Peter has always considered less sensible than himself, makes a small fortune. He sold the contract for 3 bulbs, common ones, nothing special, and paid off his entire boat. He walks with a new swagger. He offers to buy Peter a drink with a theatrical flourish of his coin purse. That night, Peter can't sleep. The steady, predictable rhythm of his life suddenly feels like a cage. He thinks of his brother-in-law, free of debt, laughing in the tavern. He thinks of the stories of weavers becoming merchants. The fear of being left behind begins to gnaw at him. The next day, he goes to one of the colleges. He just wants to watch, he tells himself. The place is packed. The air is electric. He doesn't understand the jargon, the talk of aces and periwinkles, the complex gradations of value, but he understands the mood. He sees a man, a cooper he recognizes, buy a note for a bulb called Yellow Crown for 400 guilders. Not 20 minutes later, amidst a flurry of bidding, that same cooper sells the note for 550 guilders. He has made 150 guilders, a half year's wages for Peter. In the time it takes to drink a beer, the cooper is beaming, accepting slaps on the back. He's a hero, a financial wizard. Peter feels the hook sink deep. The risk seems to vanish, replaced by a certainty that this is the future. He has some savings, put away for a new set of sail-making tools. It's 200 guilders, a significant sum for him. He spends the next hour nursing a small beer, his heart pounding in his chest. He watches, he listens. A man is offering a contract for a bulb called Le Verve, the Widow, a respectable, mid-tier tulip. The bidding starts at 180. On a wild, terrifying impulse, Peter shouts, 200. The room goes quiet for a second, all eyes on him. The sailmaker, he feels a hot flush of panic. What has he done? But the seller grins and nods. Sold to the sailmaker for 200. Someone claps him on the shoulder. He signs the paper, his hand trembling so badly he can barely write his own name. He hands over his entire savings. He now owns a piece of paper that says in the summer he will be the owner of 1 Le Verve tulip bulb. He feels sick. He goes home, unable to explain to his wife what he's done. He hides the paper. For 2 days he is consumed by anxiety. He can't eat. He can't work. He's ruined his family. He's a fool. On the 3rd day, he forces himself to go back to the tavern. He needs to know. He stands in the corner, clutching his note. He hears men talking about Le Verve. A frost in France has reportedly damaged some of their tulip crop. There's a rumour that Le Verve bulbs will be rarer than expected. The price is rising. A merchant is asking if anyone is selling. Peter's heart is a drum against his ribs. He feels 100 pairs of eyes on him. Someone who saw his purchase points him out. The sailmaker has one. The merchant approaches him. I'll give you 300 guilders for your contract, he says. Peter is stunned into silence. 100 guilders profit. In 3 days. It's a miracle. But then he remembers the cooper, the quick flip. Before he can think, he hears himself say with a bravado he doesn't feel, 350. The merchant studies him for a moment, then smiles. Done. The transaction is completed. Peter walks out of the tavern with 350 guilders in his purse. His original 200 plus 150 more. He feels dizzy, weightless. He has just made half a year's wages by being brave, by being smart. He wasn't a fool, he was an investor. He is no longer just Peter the sailmaker. He is Peter, the man of finance, the man who understands the tulip market. And that is how the mania consumes a person. That first taste of easy money is an intoxicating poison. Peter is now a believer. He will take that 350 guilders and he will buy a more expensive contract. He will leverage more. He will start to see his sail-making business, not as his life, but as a tedious distraction from his real work, the wind trade. He is chasing the dragon. And all around him, thousands of other Peters are doing the same thing. Together, they are creating a storm. This collective delusion was reinforced by a new culture of connoisseurship. To justify the insane prices, the speculators developed an elaborate and arcane system of classification. It wasn't enough for a tulip to be beautiful. It had to have the right name, the right lineage. Bulbs were divided into families: the rosen, red or pink on white; the violetin, purple or lilac on white, and the Bizarden, red, brown, or purple on yellow. Within these families were hundreds of named varieties, each with its own perceived value and personality. A whole new vocabulary emerged. Connoisseurs would debate the merits of a feathered flame versus a flamed one. They would scrutinize the shape of the petals, the clarity of the colors, the symmetry of the pattern. A bulb's weight was measured in aces, a tiny unit of measurement used by apothecaries, making the whole business sound more scientific and precise than it was. This created an illusion of sophisticated analysis. It made gambling feel like an art form. It allowed the traders to believe they weren't just guessing. They were experts in a complex and noble field. If an outsider questioned how a flower bulb could be worth 5,000 guilders, they could be dismissed with a wave of the hand. "Ah, but you don't understand," the connoisseur would say. "This is a Semper Augustus. Its break is perfect. Its flame is unparalleled." The expertise was a shield against common sense. And all of this entire towering edifice of value, was happening during the dead of winter. This is perhaps the most surreal element of all. The object of everyone's desire was completely invisible. It was an idea, a memory of last spring's bloom, a hope for the one to come. The ground was frozen. The canals were slick with ice. A bitter wind blew in from the North Sea. People huddled indoors, and in the warm, crowded spaces of the taverns, they traded ghosts. The cold, dark nights of the Dutch winter were the perfect incubator for this kind of fever. With little else to do, the colleges became the center of social and economic life. The trading went on day and night, fueled by gin and speculation. The real world, the world of seasons and soil and hard work, seemed to fade away. The only reality that mattered was the ever-rising numbers being chalked on a slate board on the tavern wall. Each new high was a cause for celebration, a validation that they were all on the right path. This was the absolute peak, the moment of maximum delusion. The winter of 1636 to 1637 was when a single promissory note for a flower you couldn't see was considered a more stable and desirable asset than a house, a farm, or a ship full of goods. It was a time when the abstract value of a thing completely overwhelmed its physical reality. People were no longer trading in tulips. They were trading in pure, distilled greed. They were trading in the shared dream that the price would never go down. They were selling the wind, and for a few short, dizzying months, everyone was buying it. The prices scribbled on those scraps of paper were as beautiful and as fragile as the petals of the Semper Augustus itself, and the whole country was holding its breath, waiting for the spring, when all this paper would finally blossom into real, solid, endless wealth. They had no idea that the frost was about to set in. Chapter 5. The Inevitable Crash. Panic in Harlem. That frost, the one they never saw coming, didn't arrive with a dramatic, sweeping blizzard. It didn't announce itself with a clap of thunder. It began quietly, almost trivially, in the back room of a tavern in the city of Harlem. The date was February 3rd, 1637. It was a cold day, as most are in a Dutch February. The kind of damp, bone-aching cold that seeps through wool and leather and settles deep in your joints. Inside the tavern, the air was thick with the familiar smells of stale beer, pipe smoke, and nervous expectation. This was a routine auction, one of hundreds that had been happening all winter in taverns just like this. All across the Netherlands, men were gathered, not to drink and be merry, but to conduct the most serious business of their lives, the buying and selling of wind. On the block today was a collection of bulbs, including a pound of the rather fashionable Schilder and a few Viceroy bulbs, which had been trading at prices that could comfortably purchase a large and well-appointed townhouse. The auctioneer, a man whose voice was usually a confident, booming instrument, cleared his throat and began the proceedings. He presented the first lot, a particularly handsome Viceroy contract, its ownership represented by a slip of notarized paper promising delivery of the bulb in the spring. He called for an opening bid, a number that a month ago would have seemed laughably low, but was still a fortune. And then, something unprecedented happened. Nothing. Just silence. A heavy, profound quiet that swallowed the auctioneer's voice. He paused, perhaps thinking he had misspoken, or that the crowd was simply slow to warm up. The men in the room weren't looking at him, though. They were looking at each other. They were looking at the floor. They were studying the contents of their empty beer mugs with intense concentration. You could feel the collective temperature in the room drop a few degrees. This was not the boisterous competitive clamour of a bull market. This was the sound of a vacuum. The auctioneer tried again, his voice a little less steady this time. He lowered the starting price. Still the silence held. It was no longer just a pause. It was a presence. It was a statement. The invisible shared dream that had fueled this entire enterprise, the unshakable belief that there was always someone else willing to pay more, had just evaporated in this one smoky room. No one wanted to be the first to bid, because for the first time no one was sure there would be a second. The man who was supposed to sell his viceroy could feel the sweat on his brow turn to ice. His paper fortune was at this very moment turning back into paper. He pressed the auctioneer to try a third time, his voice a desperate whisper. The price was lowered again, then again, slashed to a fraction of what it had been trading for just the day before. The silence that answered was now mocking, absolute. It was the sound of a cliff edge that no one had seen until they were already halfway over it. There were no buyers, not for that price, not for any price. The sellers, who had walked into that tavern as wealthy men on paper, exchanged panicked glances. They tried to feign nonchalance, to laugh it off as a strange fluke, a momentary chill in the market. But they couldn't fool themselves, and they certainly couldn't fool each other. They had all just peered into the abyss. They had just witnessed the impossible, a tulip auction where no one bought a single tulip. The auction was cancelled. Men shuffled out of the tavern, not speaking, avoiding eye contact, pulling their coats tight against a cold that was now both outside and in. They were carrying their precious contracts, which suddenly felt flimsy and worthless in their hands. News, in the 17th century, didn't travel at the speed of light. It travelled at the speed of a horse, or a barge, or a fast-walking man with a rumour to spread. And this rumour, the news from Harlem, was the most potent virus imaginable. It left the city and began to snake its way along the frozen canals and muddy roads towards the other epicenters of the mania. Imagine a messenger, his face raw from the wind, bursting into a tavern in Amsterdam that evening. He doesn't even have the full story, just the shocking headline. They held an auction in Harlem. Nobody came. The effect was instantaneous. It was like shouting fire in a crowded theatre where everyone was already smelling smoke. In Amsterdam, the great heart of Dutch commerce, brokers who heard the news immediately tried to offload their own stock. They rushed to the coffee houses, the exchanges, seeking anyone, anywhere, who hadn't yet heard the tidings from Harlem. But the virus of fear travelled faster than any seller. The question was no longer how much can I get for my bulbs. It was, can I sell my bulbs at all? Within days the panic was everywhere. Leiden, Delft, Alkmaar, Hoorn. The story was the same. Auctions were held, and they were met with the same deafening silence as the one in Harlem. Prices didn't just dip. They didn't just correct. They fell off a cliff. A Semper Augustus bulb, which had been valued at 10,000 guilders a week before, enough to feed, clothe and house a family for a lifetime, was now struggling to find a buyer for 1,000, and then 100, and then nothing. The market had ceased to exist. It had been replaced by a frantic, scrambling mob, all trying to shove their way through an exit door that had suddenly shrunk to the size of a keyhole. This is the moment where we need to take a step back and appreciate the beautiful, terrifying architecture of this collapse. If people had been trading actual physical tulips, the crash would have been bad, but not this catastrophic. A seller would at least be left holding a flower bulb. It might be worth a fraction of what he paid for it, but it was a tangible object. He could plant it, and in the spring, a lovely, if absurdly expensive flower would bloom. But that's not what they were trading. They were trading in the wind handle. The entire market was built on futures contracts. A weaver in January didn't buy a bulb from a merchant. He bought a promise that the merchant would deliver a specific bulb to him in June. He paid for this promise, perhaps with a small down payment, but more often than not, he paid for it with another promise, a promise to pay the full, exorbitant amount upon delivery. But the weaver had no intention of ever taking delivery of that bulb. His plan was to sell the contract, that piece of paper, to a baker in February for a higher price. The baker in turn would sell it to a lawyer in March for an even higher price. It was a daisy chain of IOs, a skyscraper built not on foundations, but on the assumption that someone, somewhere down the line, would eventually materialize with a mountain of gold to settle all the accounts. The value wasn't in the bulb, it was in the piece of paper, and the value of that piece of paper was based entirely on the collective belief that its value would continue to rise indefinitely. The moment that belief was broken, the moment that auction in Harlem failed, the entire skyscraper swayed, groaned, and then pancaked into dust. Every single person in that chain was suddenly, simultaneously, in trouble. The lawyer who had agreed to buy the contract for 5,000 guilders in March now refused to pay. Why would he? The underlying bulb was now worth maybe 50 guilders, so he defaults on his promise to the baker. The baker, who was counting on that 5,000 guilders to cover the 4,000 guilders he promised to the weaver, now also has to default. And the weaver, who started this whole chain, is now legally obligated to pay the original merchant, say 3,000 guilders for a bulb he cannot sell, and certainly cannot afford. Multiply this scenario by tens of thousands of transactions across every level of society, and you begin to understand the scale of the cataclysm. It was a domino rally in a hurricane. If you've ever felt that sinking, nauseous feeling of watching your crypto portfolio or your favorite tech stock drop by 20% in a day, take a moment and send your sympathies back in time. These Dutchmen were watching their entire net worth, often a net worth that was entirely imaginary and built on debt, evaporate not by the day but by the hour. There were no circuit breakers. There was no buy-the-dip mentality. There was only pure, uncut 17th century panic. The social fabric of the Netherlands, a country built on contracts, on trust, on a merchant's word being his bond, began to tear. The cosy taverns that had been scenes of boisterous speculation now became arenas of bitter confrontation. Men who had been clapping each other on the back a month ago, celebrating their shared genius, were now at each other's throats. Friendships that had lasted a lifetime were shattered over a worthless piece of paper. Imagine the scene, repeated in homes and on street corners across the country. A man, let's call him Peter, a tailor who had sold his workshop to buy a single Gouda bulb contract, is now banging on the door of the wealthy merchant who had agreed to buy it from him. The merchant opens the door, his face a grim mask. Peter, waving the contract, demands his 4,000 guilders. The merchant simply shakes his head. The deal is off, he says. That paper is worthless. But we had a contract. Peter would scream, his voice cracking. It's notarized. It's legal. And the merchant, who himself was owed a fortune by others who would not pay him, would simply reply, "Then take me to court. Everyone is taking everyone to court. Get in line." And he was right. The courts of the Dutch Republic were suddenly drowning in a tsunami of litigation. Judges and magistrates, men used to dealing with stolen chickens and property disputes, were now faced with a philosophical crisis of epic proportions. They were being asked to enforce tens of thousands of contracts for transactions that now seemed utterly insane. The core of the problem was a simple, yet profound question. What exactly had been sold? The creditors, the ones who had sold contracts at high prices and were now owed fortunes, argued vehemently that a contract is a contract. It is the bedrock of our society, they proclaimed. It doesn't matter if the price of grain, or herring, or tulips goes up or down. A deal is a deal. You signed the paper. You owe the money. To rule otherwise would be to undermine the very concept of commerce. The debtors, a much larger and more desperate group, had a different perspective. This wasn't commerce, they argued. This was gambling. It was a fever, a collective madness. They called it wind handle, the wind trade for a reason. Nothing of substance was ever exchanged. It was a bet on a future price, and now that the bet had been lost, the courts had no business enforcing gambling debts, to ruin thousands of hard-working citizens. To throw them and their families into the street over a foolish wager on a flower would be a moral abomination. The judges were in an impossible position. If they sided with the creditors and enforced the contracts, they would trigger a wave of bankruptcies so vast it could cripple the nation's economy for a generation. Thousands of artisans, shopkeepers and farmers would lose everything. The social unrest would be unimaginable. But if they sided with the debtors and declared the contracts void, they would be setting a dangerous precedent. They would be rewarding reckless speculation and punishing those who had, in theory, played by the rules. It would signal that in the Dutch Republic, a signed contract could simply be ignored if it became inconvenient. How could international trade function on that basis? While the courts were paralyzed with indecision, the situation on the ground was deteriorating. The panic selling had stopped, mainly because there was no one left to sell to. The market had been replaced by a sullen, angry standoff. No goods were moving, no debts were being paid. The economy was grinding to a halt, frozen by uncertainty and fear. Seeing the abyss yawning before them, the city governments began to intervene, not with the force of law, but as mediators. They were less concerned with legal theory and more with practical damage control. They needed to get people talking again, to find some way out of the impasse that wouldn't involve mass bankruptcy and riots. In Amsterdam, a commission of city officials summoned representatives from the florists' guilds. The scene must have been extraordinary. A room filled with the nation's most prominent tulip traders, men who a few weeks prior had considered themselves the new masters of the universe, now sitting humbled and terrified, begging the government to help them sort out the mess they had created. The initial proposals were optimistic. One idea was that all contracts made during the height of the mania should be converted into options. The buyer could choose to either fulfill the contract at the agreed-upon price, or they could pay a small option fee, say 10% of the contract price, and walk away from the deal. This sounded reasonable in theory. It offered the debtors a way out without complete ruin, and it gave the creditors at least something, but it failed spectacularly in practice. Why? Because human nature. The debtors, seeing the market had utterly collapsed, felt that even paying 10% was an outrage. They had been victims of a scam, they reasoned, so why should they pay another guilder? The creditors, on the other hand, were furious. They had been promised 100% of the contract value. Getting only 10% was an insult, especially for the few, the very few, who had actually been trading in real bulbs and had managed their risk. Why should they be punished for the insanity of the mob? The negotiations collapsed into bitter recriminations. No one was willing to compromise. Everyone felt they were the victim. Everyone felt the other side was acting in bad faith. As the weeks dragged on, it became clear that there was no elegant solution. There was no clever financial instrument or legal compromise that could paper over the chasm between what was promised and what could be paid. The debt was simply too large, the assets too worthless. The government, from the city councils all the way up to the Court of Holland, realized that they were not dealing with a normal market correction. They were dealing with a societal breakdown, and their primary job was not to ensure financial justice, but to ensure the survival of the society itself. So they made a choice. It was a brutal, pragmatic, and ultimately necessary choice. In a series of edicts and rulings throughout 1637 and 1638, the authorities effectively chose to amputate the gangrenous limb to save the patient. The High Courts ruled that the judges should handle the cases as they saw fit, but strongly signalled that any futures contracts written after November 1636 and before the crash in February, the very height of the wind handle, were to be considered non-binding. The legal reasoning was that these were not legitimate commercial transactions but were in fact gambling debts, and Dutch law, then as now, did not use the power of the state to enforce wagers. This was the bombshell, the Great Reset. With this single stroke, the vast majority of the tulip debt was simply wiped off the books. It didn't just become smaller, it vanished. The courts were telling the creditors, "You made a bet, and you lost. The person who owes you money has no legal obligation to pay you. You are on your own." For the tens of thousands of debtors, the weavers, the bakers, the farmers, it was a miracle. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card. The crushing weight of a lifetime of debt was lifted from their shoulders. They were not saved. Many had already sold real assets and lost fortunes they'd never recover. But they were not going to be pursued through the courts for the imaginary fortunes they had promised to pay. The slate for them was wiped clean. For the creditors, however, it was the final devastating blow. These were the big merchants, the professional speculators, and the lucky few who had sold at the peak. They were the ones holding all the paper, all the promises that were supposed to make them impossibly rich, and the government had just officially declared that paper to be worthless. Their assets had been legally vaporized. They were the ones left holding the bag, a bag that the law now recognized as being filled with nothing but wind. This decision was not about fairness, it was about stability. The government chose to bankrupt a relatively small number of wealthy speculators in order to prevent the complete insolvency of a massive portion of the working and middle classes. They sacrificed the few to save the many. It was a cold and calculated act of social triage. With the legal and financial crisis more or less nullified, a new, more urgent need arose. The need for a story. Society needed to make sense of what had just happened. It couldn't just be a story of bad math and market dynamics. It had to be a morality play. And so, the great assigning of blame began. Almost immediately, a flood of pamphlets, satirical poems, and cautionary sermons appeared. The narrative was quickly cemented. This was not a financial phenomenon, it was a spiritual sickness. The Dutch people, famous for their thrift, their piety, and their common sense, had been temporarily possessed by the demons of greed and folly. The florists, once celebrated as clever entrepreneurs, were now recast as the villains of the story. They were portrayed as greedy, ungodly tricksters who had bewitched the populace with a worthless flower. The tulip itself, once a symbol of beauty and status, became a symbol of vanity, foolishness, and the transience of earthly things. The famous satirical paintings from this era, like Jan Bruegel the Younger's satire on Tulip Mania, depict speculators as brainless monkeys, weighing tulips, counting money, and ultimately being led to ruin and carried to their graves. The message was clear. This is what happens when you abandon honest work and God-fearing sobriety for the get-rich-quick fantasies of the gambling den. This moral narrative was incredibly useful. It allowed everyone who lost money, which was almost everyone, to absolve themselves of responsibility. They weren't stupid, they were just caught up in a collective madness, a sinful fever that had swept the land. It was a way for the nation to process its trauma and shame, to distance itself from the foolishness and pretend that it had all been a bizarre dream. It allowed them to say, that wasn't the real us. We're back to our senses now. This is a pattern we see after every financial bubble bursts, from the South Sea bubble to the dot-com crash to the 2008 financial crisis. First comes the panic, then the reset, and then the search for scapegoats and a comforting moral lesson. So, as the spring of 1637 finally arrived, the Netherlands was a nation nursing a colossal hangover. The paper fortunes had blown away like dust. The legal battles had fizzled out into a grudging, resentful stalemate. The moralists were having a field day, churning out their "I told you so" pamphlets. And the tulips, the actual physical tulips that had caused all this chaos, they were, of course, completely oblivious to the drama. In the rich Dutch soil, the Semper Augustus, the Viceroy, and the thousands of other bulbs were doing what they had always done. They were quietly pushing their green shoots up through the cold earth, getting ready to bloom. For the men who had gambled everything on them, seeing them flower that spring must have been a uniquely painful experience. They were still beautiful, they were still rare, but they were no longer magic. They were no longer the key to a golden future. They were just flowers again, and the difference between the dream of what they represented in winter and the reality of what they were in spring was the measure of all that had been lost. The fever had broken, the madness was over, and the quiet, sober, and for many, impoverished business of ordinary life had to begin again. Chapter 6. Rethinking the Ruin, the myth versus the reality of the crash. And so the quiet, sober, and for many, impoverished business of ordinary life had to begin again. That word, impoverished, hangs in the air, doesn't it? It's a heavy word, full of consequence. It conjures images of ruin, of families turned out into the street, of a nation brought to its knees by a flower. This is the story we all know, the one that has been passed down for centuries. It's the story of a great humbling, a cautionary tale of greed that ends in a nationwide depression. We picture Dutch merchants, famous for their stoicism and black hats, flinging themselves into the canals of Amsterdam. We imagine skilled artisans selling their tools for pennies, the looms of Leiden falling silent, the great ships of the Dutch East India Company rotting in their harbours because the entire economy had simply stopped. It's a powerful narrative. It's dramatic. It's a morality play written on a grand national scale, and for the most part it's a beautifully constructed myth. The reality, as modern historians have painstakingly pieced it together, is far more nuanced, far less cinematic, and in its own way, far more fascinating. To truly understand what happened after the music stopped in February of 1637, we have to gently take that dramatic painting of total ruin off the wall and replace it with a much more complicated, and frankly, much more human portrait. The Dutch Republic wasn't ruined by tulips. It wasn't even seriously injured. For the vast majority of its citizens, life went on almost entirely as before. The crash was not a national economic catastrophe. It was more like a vicious, localized storm that ripped through a very specific, very wealthy neighborhood, leaving behind a trail of financial wreckage, bruised egos, and a great deal of public embarrassment. So let's settle in, and together, let's perform a bit of historical forensics. Let's look at the evidence and separate the enduring legend from the slightly messy, less dramatic, but ultimately more truthful story. Our first clue that the popular story might be a bit overblown comes when we ask a very simple question. Who was actually trading these tulips? The myth would have us believe it was everyone. Chimney sweeps, bakers, weavers, farmers, all supposedly caught up in the frenzy, selling their homes and their livelihoods for a single bulb. This image of a class-leveling madness is a key part of the legend. It's the idea that the mania was a democratic fever, infecting every level of society. But the records, the contracts, the court documents that have survived, they tell a different story. They show that the really high-stakes trading, the kind that involved bulbs worth more than a townhouse, was almost exclusively the domain of the wealthy. We're talking about prosperous merchants, high-ranking officials, wealthy industrialists, and skilled professionals like lawyers and notaries. These were people who already had significant capital. They were the 1% of the 17th century. For them, speculating on tulips was not a desperate gamble to escape poverty. It was an exciting, high-risk, high-reward investment on the side. It was an extension of the same speculative spirit that saw them investing in risky shipping voyages to the East Indies or financing new land reclamation projects. They were playing with risk capital, money they could, in theory, afford to lose, even if losing it would be profoundly unpleasant. Now, does this mean no one from the lower classes was involved? Not at all. The fever did trickle down, but it did so in a different form. We see evidence of skilled artisans, master craftsmen, and successful shopkeepers getting involved. A brewer, a baker, a textile dyer, people in the solid upper middle class. They might have risked a few hundred guilders, maybe even 1,000, which was a huge sum for them, often an entire year's income, and for them, the crash was devastating. These were the people who were truly hurt, the ones who lost life-altering sums of money, but they weren't selling the family goat to get in on the action. They were risking their savings, their profits, the money they had earmarked for expansion or retirement. The idea of the common labourer or the poor farmer being a major player is where the myth really takes flight. It's highly unlikely a person struggling to feed their family wasn't going to have the collateral, the connections, or the basic surplus of cash to enter a market where the entry fee was often several months' wages. They might have witnessed it, gossiped about it in the taverns, perhaps even dreamed of it, but they were largely spectators, not players. The whole spectacle was a drama unfolding in the parlours and back rooms of the wealthy, not in the fields and workshops of the common man. So, when the crash came, it didn't wipe out the savings of the entire nation. It primarily wiped out the speculative profits and some of the capital of a relatively small, interconnected group of affluent individuals. The second, and perhaps most important piece of our investigation, is understanding what precisely these people were trading. As we touched on before, during the height of the mania in the winter of 1636 to 1637, almost nobody was trading actual physical tulip bulbs. You couldn't, they were dormant, planted safely in the ground, waiting for spring. To dig one up would be to kill the flower and render the bulb worthless. Instead, they were trading paper, they were trading promises. This was the infamous wind handle, the wind trade. It was a market based entirely on futures contracts. A buyer would sign a piece of paper promising to purchase a specific bulb, say a viceroy, from a seller at a specific price on a future date, usually once the bulbs could be safely lifted from the ground in the spring. This is a profoundly important distinction. It turned the tulip market from a trade in goods into a trade in financial derivatives. It was the 17th century version of futures and options trading. No money had to change hands at the time the deal was struck. No bulbs had to be exchanged. It was all a game of contractual obligations, of pure speculation on future value. You could buy a contract for a Semper Augustus for 5,000 guilders in November, watch its paper value rise, and sell that same contract to someone else for 7,000 guilders in January, making a 2,000 guilder profit without ever seeing, touching or smelling a single tulip. The bulb itself was almost incidental. It was the abstract concept of its soaring value that was the real commodity. This wind trade is what allowed the bubble to inflate so rapidly. Because no real assets were being exchanged, the market became unmoored from physical reality. It was fueled by pure optimism and the collective belief that prices would continue to rise indefinitely. It also meant that many people were trading with money they didn't actually have, leveraging their existing assets and reputation to sign contracts for staggering sums, fully expecting to sell the contract at a profit before they ever had to actually pay up. Think of it like this. It's a high-stakes game of musical chairs played with IOUs. As long as the music is playing and everyone is passing the IOUs around at ever higher values, everyone feels rich. The problem, of course, comes when the music stops, and you're the one left holding an IOU for $1 million chair that everyone suddenly agrees is just a plain wooden chair. And this is exactly what happened in the first week of February 1637. The music didn't just stop, someone yanked the phonograph needle across the record. The precipitating event seems to have been a routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem. A consignment of tulips came up for sale, and for the first time in months, the buyers didn't materialize. Or, if they did, they weren't willing to pay the astronomical prices. There was a moment of hesitation, a crack in the collective confidence. News of this faltering auction, this moment of doubt, spread like a contagion. All it took was that tiny seed of uncertainty. Suddenly, everyone who was holding a contract, a piece of paper obligating them to buy a tulip for a fortune in a few months' time, was struck by a terrifying thought. What if the person I was planning to sell this to has gotten cold feet? What if the price doesn't go up? What if it goes down? Panic is a social phenomenon. It's the catastrophic loss of shared belief. Within days, the entire paper-based market collapsed. Everyone wanted to sell their contracts, and nobody wanted to buy. The price of a promise plummeted. A contract for a tulip that was worth 5,000 guilders one week was worth, well, the paper it was printed on the next. The value hadn't just decreased, it had evaporated, because the value was never in the bulb itself, it was in the shared delusion, and the delusion had vanished. So now we arrive at the heart of the national ruin myth. We have thousands of people holding contracts, legally binding documents, obligating them to pay fortunes for flowers that were now worth a fraction of the agreed-upon price. The sellers, who thought they were rich, went to the buyers to collect their money. The buyers, who had planned to sell the contracts for a profit, now faced the horrifying prospect of having to actually pay up, a prospect that would mean certain bankruptcy for many. This is the moment where, in the mythical version, the suicides begin, and the economy grinds to a halt. But what happened next is the quiet, bureaucratic and distinctly Dutch twist that saved the Republic from a genuine crisis. The sheer scale of the problem was its own solution. So many people were on the hook, from such influential circles, that enforcing all these contracts to the letter of the law would have caused a genuine wave of bankruptcies among the merchant elite. It would have been a self-inflicted wound on the heart of the Dutch economy. Faced with this potential chaos, the Dutch legal and political system did something remarkable. They essentially called a nationwide time-out. The courts, flooded with lawsuits from sellers trying to enforce their contracts, basically threw up their hands. They delayed hearings. They obfuscated. They expressed a profound legal reluctance to ruin a prominent citizen over what was starting to look less like a legitimate business transaction and more like a gambling debt. The government stepped in, not with a bailout, but with a resolution. In late February 1637, the States of Holland decreed that all tulip contracts made during the bubble could be voided by the buyer for a small fee, a penalty payment of just 3.5% of the contract's price. Later, different cities would propose their own solutions, usually allowing buyers to get out of their contracts for a payment of around 5 to 10% of the original price. This was a truly extraordinary move. The government effectively decided to rewrite history. They retroactively transformed legally binding futures contracts into something more like an options contract. You no longer had to buy the tulip at the exorbitant price. You now had the option to walk away for a small penalty. This decision was the pin that deflated the crisis before it could explode. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card, economically speaking. For the buyers, who were facing financial annihilation, it was a lifeline. Instead of owing 5,000 guilders, they now owed maybe 250. It was still a painful loss, but it was survivable. For the sellers, it was a disaster, but a mitigated one. They weren't going to get the small fortune they had been dreaming of. Their paper wealth was gone, but they might at least recover a small fraction of the contract price. And most importantly, they still had the physical bulb itself, which, while no longer a get-rich-quick scheme, still had some real, albeit much lower value. The result was not a wave of bankruptcies, but a wave of messy, acrimonious negotiations. For months and even years afterward, Dutch courts were filled with florists and merchants arguing over who owed whom what, but the systemic risk was gone. The state had refused to preside over a mass execution of its own merchant class. It was a pragmatic, if legally questionable, solution to an unprecedented problem. It was less economic policy, and more everyone just calm down and take a deep breath. With this understanding, we can now zoom out and look at the broader Dutch economy of 1637. Was it showing any signs of a nationwide depression? The answer is a resounding no. This was the absolute zenith of the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen, a veritable state within a state with its own army, navy, and a trade monopoly stretching across Asia. Its ships continued to sail. Its profits continued to flow into Amsterdam. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first, didn't crash. The Bank of Amsterdam, the financial bedrock of Europe, remained perfectly stable. The herring fleets still fished the North Sea. The shipyards of Zaandam still churned out vessels at an astonishing rate, and Dutch textiles still dominated the European market. The Dutch economy was a vast and complex engine of global commerce. Tulip Mania, in this context, was like a single, overheated gear in that massive machine. When it seized up and broke, it made a terrible noise, threw off a lot of smoke, and caused a great deal of trouble for the mechanics standing right next to it. But the engine as a whole just kept running. The money lost in the tulip crash, while significant for the individuals involved, was a pittance compared to the capital flowing through the VOC or the Amsterdam Bank. The nation's economic fundamentals were simply too strong to be shaken by a speculative bubble in a luxury commodity. There's no evidence of a rise in unemployment, no significant drop in trade volumes, no sign of a general economic malaise in the years following 1637. Life, for the 99% of the population who hadn't been playing the tulip market, went on. So if the ruin was a myth, where did the myth come from? Why does this story of national disaster persist so powerfully, even today? The answer lies in the immediate aftermath. The Dutch, a society deeply infused with Calvinist values of sobriety, thrift and hard work, were profoundly embarrassed by what had just happened. The mania was seen not just as a financial folly, but as a moral failing. Preachers thundered from the pulpits against the sin of greed, the vanity of worldly goods, and the foolishness of gambling. Almost immediately, a flood of propaganda appeared. Satirical pamphlets, poems, and engravings mocking the tulip traders. These were the 17th century equivalent of memes. One famous engraving, Flora's Wagon of Fools, depicts the Roman goddess of flowers in a cart with a group of drunkards and speculators sailing toward the Sea of Oblivion, their ship adorned with tulip-themed sails. They are being led by weavers and other artisans who have supposedly abandoned their trades. It was a potent piece of social commentary, meant to shame those who had gotten swept up in the craze and to reinforce traditional values. These pamphlets were immensely popular, and they created a durable, cartoonish image of the mania that emphasized its most absurd and destructive aspects. These contemporary accounts, steeped in moral judgment, were then picked up by later writers. The story lay relatively dormant for a couple of centuries, until it was spectacularly revived in 1841 by a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay in his famous book Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Mackay was a brilliant writer and a captivating storyteller, but he was not a rigorous historian. His method was to gather the most colourful, most dramatic anecdotes he could find and weave them together into a compelling narrative. He cherry-picked from the most sensationalist of the 17th century pamphlets. He repeated unverified stories of sailors eating priceless bulbs by mistake and foreign nobles paying fortunes for single flowers. His chapter on Tulip Mania is a masterpiece of narrative drama, full of vivid imagery and dire warnings about human folly, and it is, almost single-handedly, the source of the modern myth. Mackay's version of the story of national ruin, of suicides in canals, of a whole society losing its mind, was so powerful and so well told that it became the accepted truth for over a century. It was the story everyone wanted to believe. And why do we want to believe it? Because the myth of Tulip Mania is a perfect parable. It's a simple, tidy story about the dangers of greed. It's a historical precedent that gets trotted out every time a new speculative bubble appears, from the dot-com boom to the crypto craze. It serves as a timeless warning that pride comes before a fall, that easy money is never truly easy, and that the madness of crowds can lead us to ruin. The real story is messier. It's a story about a specific group of people, in a specific time and place, who got carried away. It's a story about the birth of modern financial instruments before the birth of modern financial regulations. It's a story about a government fumbling its way through a crisis and finding a pragmatic, if imperfect, solution. It's a story not of national ruin, but of a contained financial fire, quickly extinguished by a dose of legal pragmatism, followed by a long period of collective shame-faced silence. The Dutch merchants who lost money didn't by and large jump into canals. They did what merchants do. They took their losses, they argued with their lawyers, they grumbled about the injustice of it all, and then they got back to business. They went back to trading spices from the east, timber from the Baltic, and wine from France. They went back to building the formidable economic empire that defined their golden age. The tulips themselves, of course, were innocent bystanders in all of this. Once the fever broke, they didn't become worthless. The prices simply returned to something resembling sanity. A rare and beautiful tulip was still a valuable luxury good, worth 100 guilders, maybe even a few hundred. They were no longer the ticket to unimaginable wealth, but they were still a status symbol, a delight for the gardens of the rich. The professional tulip trade continued, chastened and humbled, but it continued. The flower itself was never the problem. The problem, as always, was a very human one. The intoxicating, dangerous, and ultimately fleeting dream of getting something for nothing. The reality shows us something quieter. It merely broke a lot of promises, and in doing so taught the Dutch a lesson about the difference between the value of a thing and the price we are willing, in a moment of collective madness, to imagine for it. And as the ink dried on the final, bitter settlements, the real, tangible tulips were already pushing their way up through the dark Dutch soil, ready for a spring stripped of all its financial fantasy, a spring where a flower was, once again, just a flower. Chapter 7. Echoes Through Time. The Anatomy of a Bubble. The real, tangible tulips were already pushing their way up through the dark Dutch soil, ready for a spring stripped of all its financial fantasy, a spring where a flower was, once again, just a flower. But the strange thing about us, about people, is that we have a remarkably hard time letting a flower just be a flower, or letting a piece of land just be a piece of land, or letting a new invention just be a new invention. We are creatures of narrative. We look at a simple, beautiful thing, and our minds immediately begin to weave stories around it, to imbue it with meaning, with status, and eventually with a price tag that bears no resemblance to the thing itself. The madness may have subsided in the Netherlands, but the blueprint it created, the emotional DNA of the bubble, had been released into the world. Tulip Mania wasn't a strange one-off event, a quirky historical footnote. It was the prototype. It was the dress rehearsal for a play that humanity would stage again, and again and again, right up to this very moment. It's a story whose echoes are so loud they can feel more like a continuous hum, the background noise of our modern economic world. So, let's pull the camera back from the smoke-filled taverns of Haarlem and look at the anatomy of this fever, this collective dream state, because once you understand the structure, you start to see it everywhere. Financial historians, in their quest to make sense of our recurring nonsense, often talk about the stages of a bubble. They give them formal names, of course, but it's really just a story in 5 acts, a story we seem compelled to perform. The first act is always one of displacement. Something new happens, something that shifts our perspective, that captures our imagination. It could be a war ending, a new technology being invented, or in the case of the Dutch, the arrival of an impossibly beautiful and exotic flower from a faraway land. It's the spark. It's the moment a new story begins. A story that suggests the old rules might not apply anymore. This new thing, the story goes, is special. It's different. This flower isn't just a plant. It's a symbol of divine artistry and worldly status. Its uniqueness feels like a guarantee of its value. This leads us to the second act, the boom. The story starts to spread. The price of the new thing begins to rise, slowly at first, and then with more confidence. Early investors, the ones who got in on the ground floor, are making handsome returns. Their success is the best marketing campaign imaginable. It looks so easy, and crucially, this is the stage where credit enters the picture. People see the prices rising faster than their savings can grow, so they start to borrow. They leverage their homes, their businesses, their futures, all to get a piece of the action. In Amsterdam, this was the moment when the actual exchange of bulbs became secondary to the exchange of paper contracts. Wealth was no longer something you held in your hand. It was a number on a promissory note, a flicker of potential. This is a critical step. The boom inflates when the money chasing the asset is no longer just the money that people have, but also the money they hope to have. Then comes the third, and most famous, act, euphoria. This is the mania. This is the part of the story that gets all the attention. Logic has officially left the building. It's been replaced by a powerful, intoxicating belief that this time is different. Any cautionary voice is dismissed as a fool, a cynic, someone who just doesn't get it. Prices detach completely from any underlying reality. A single tulip bulb is now worth more than a mansion. The stories become absurd. A weaver trades his entire livelihood for a root. A sailor mistakes a priceless bulb for an onion and eats it with his herring. Everyone is a genius. Your baker, your tailor, your neighbour, they're all getting rich, and they can't stop talking about it. This is the peak of the social contagion, driven by one of the most powerful human emotions, the fear of being left behind. The pain of watching others succeed while you stand on the sidelines becomes unbearable, so you jump in, not because you've studied the fundamentals of the tulip market, but because you can't stand it anymore. You buy at the top, telling yourself that prices can only go up, because to believe otherwise would be to admit you're the last fool in a long line of them. The fourth act is quieter, almost invisible. It's the moment of distress, or what insiders might call profit-taking. A few people, the ones who were a little closer to the centre of the game, the ones who perhaps never truly believed the story but were happy to ride the wave, decide that things have gotten a little too silly. They look at the absurd number on their piece of paper and think, perhaps it's time to turn this fantasy back into real gold. They begin to sell, quietly at first. They don't want to cause a panic. They just want to lock in their gains. But their selling creates a small wobble. An auction in Harlem fails to attract any bids. A prominent merchant is rumoured to be cashing out. The first seeds of doubt are sown. The unshakable confidence that fueled the euphoria begins to crack. And that leads, inevitably, to the final act, panic, or revulsion. The crash. It happens with breathtaking speed. The doubt that started as a whisper becomes a scream. Everyone who rushed in, driven by the herd, now rushes for the exit, driven by that same herd. The psychology flips completely. The asset that was once a symbol of genius and infinite potential is now a toxic object, a monument to foolishness. Everyone is trying to sell, and nobody is buying. The greater fool theory, the idea that you can always sell to someone more foolish than you, collapses because you suddenly realize you are the greater fool. The price plummets, falling far faster than it ever rose. And in the aftermath, what's left is a landscape of broken promises, lawsuits and bitter recriminations. People look for someone to blame. The government, the speculators, the foreigners, anyone but the face in the mirror. And the object of their former desire, the tulip, is now regarded with disgust. It is, once again, just a flower, a worthless, useless flower. This 5-act structure is the anatomy of a bubble. And less than a century after the Dutch finally sobered up from their floral fever dream, the nation of France decided it was their turn to read from the very same script. They just found a different flower. Picture France in the early 1700s. The Sun King, Louis XIV, is dead. His legacy is a country that is the cultural centre of the world, a beacon of art and philosophy, and also a nation that is catastrophically, hopelessly bankrupt. Decades of lavish spending at Versailles and endless wars have hollowed out the treasury. The government is deep in debt, the currency is unstable, and the French people are weary. Into this desperate situation walks one of history's most fascinating characters, a man named John Law. Law was not your typical finance minister. He was a Scotsman, a brilliant mathematician, a notorious gambler, and a convicted murderer who had escaped a death sentence in England by fleeing to the continent. He was tall, handsome, and impossibly charismatic. He had a radical, intoxicating idea. He believed that the wealth of a nation wasn't based on how much gold and silver it had locked in its vaults. That was old thinking. He argued that wealth was about commerce, about trade, about the movement of goods and money. And the key to unlocking that, he preached, was paper money, managed by a central bank, which could provide a stable and elastic supply of credit to fuel the economy. In a country drowning in debt and saddled with clunky metal coins, this was a revolutionary concept. The French regent, desperate for any solution, gave Law his chance. Law established a bank, the Banque Générale, in 1716. It was a wild success. It issued paper notes that were redeemable for a fixed weight of silver, providing a stability that the government's own currency lacked. He was hailed as a genius, but this was just the beginning. This was the overture. Law's grand symphony of finance needed a bigger stage. His gaze turned to France's vast, largely ignored colonial territories in North America, specifically the colony of Louisiana. Here was his displacement, his new exotic tulip. He established a trading company, the Mississippi Company, which was granted a monopoly on all trade with the Louisiana Territory for 25 years. And John Law, being the master marketer that he was, began to weave a story. He painted a picture of Louisiana, not as it was, a swampy, mosquito-infested, sparsely populated, and strategically irrelevant piece of land, but as a mythical paradise. He published pamphlets and maps showing mountains of gold and silver, fertile fields bursting with tobacco and silk, and friendly natives eager to trade precious gems for French trinkets. It was a complete fabrication. It was a marketing campaign for a country that didn't exist. The public, hungry for hope, devoured it, and Law linked his two creations in a stroke of financial genius. He would allow people to buy shares in his magical Mississippi Company, not with gold, but with their government bonds, the very same state debt that was considered nearly worthless. It was a financial sleight of hand. People could trade their junk bonds for a piece of a golden future. This was the start of the boom. The demand for Mississippi Company shares exploded. The price began to climb, and John Law poured gasoline on the fire. He merged his company with other French trading monopolies, creating a mega corporation. He took over the collection of all French taxes. He even took over the management of the French mint. His company and the French state were becoming one and the same, and he, John Law, was at the center of it all. He made his bank the National Bank of France, the Banque Royale, and started printing more and more paper money. Why? To make it easier for people to buy more shares in his company, of course. This created a feedback loop of pure, uncut mania. The more money he printed, the more people could borrow to buy shares. The more they bought, the higher the share price went. The higher the share price went, the wealthier everyone on paper felt, and the more they believed in the genius of John Law and the magical promise of Louisiana. This was the euphoria stage, and it centered on a narrow, cramped street in Paris called the Rue Quincampoix. The Rue Quincampoix became the epicenter of this new religion of wealth. It was a chaotic, churning river of humanity. Dukes and princes rubbed shoulders with their cooks and maids. Priests jostled with soldiers, all of them screaming, bidding and clawing their way to a broker to buy shares. The street was so packed that a local hunchback found he could make a small fortune by renting out his hump as a portable writing desk for brokers to sign contracts on. Fortunes were made in an instant. A beggar one morning could be a wealthy man by noon. It was on the Rue Quincampoix that the French word millionaire was first coined, to describe the new class of people who had gotten rich from Law's system. It was the tavern trading of Amsterdam, but scaled up to the level of an entire nation's capital. No one cared about the reality of Louisiana. The story was too good, the profits too intoxicating. But a system built on printing money to inflate the value of an asset based on a fantasy is, to use a technical term, a house of cards. The distress stage began when a few powerful nobles, perhaps a little wiser or just a little more cynical than the rest, decided to cash in their chips. The Prince de Conti, a cousin of the king, famously sent 3 wagons to the Banque Royale and demanded that his paper notes be converted into gold. John Law was furious, but he had to comply. It was the first major crack in the facade. Others followed suit. They started to realize that their paper wealth was only real if they could convert it back into something tangible, like gold or land. The panic began. As more people tried to convert their paper notes into coin, Law's bank began to run out of gold and silver. To stop the bleeding, Law made a series of disastrous decisions. He devalued the currency. Then he made it illegal for any French citizen to own more than a small amount of gold. He was essentially trying to outlaw reality. Police were authorized to search people's homes for illegal stashes of precious metals. This, predictably, terrified the public. They saw their paper money, which was supposed to be as good as gold, being devalued by decree, while the real gold was being confiscated. The rush for the exits became a stampede. People mobbed the bank, desperate to get anything of value for their worthless paper. The share price of the Mississippi Company, which had soared from 500 livres to over 10,000, collapsed back down to where it started, and then lower. In less than a year, the dream had evaporated. The millionaires of yesterday were the paupers of today. The hunchback's writing desk was out of business. John Law, once the financial savior of France, became its most hated man. His carriage was mobbed, his house was stoned, and he had to flee the country in disguise, his own vast fortune completely wiped out. He died a few years later in Venice, poor and forgotten, still gambling at cards. The Mississippi bubble left France financially and psychologically scarred. For generations, the French people held a deep and profound distrust of paper money, central banks, and national debt. They had traded their savings for a story about a golden swamp. They had learned, the hard way, the difference between a price and a value. They had played out the Dutch tragedy, note for note, just on a grander scale. And as the French were cleaning up the wreckage of their financial fantasy, the British were watching from across the Channel. And with that particular blend of rivalry and superiority that has so often defined their relationship with France, they thought to themselves, a nationwide speculative mania that ends in ruin. We can certainly do that. And so they did. The British situation was remarkably similar to the French one. The nation was groaning under a mountain of debt, accumulated from, you guessed it, a series of expensive wars. The government was paying a high rate of interest on this debt, and it was a constant drain on the treasury. In 1711, a new company was chartered with a seemingly brilliant solution. It was called the Governor and Company of Merchants of Great Britain, trading to the South Seas and other parts of America, and for the encouragement of fishing. We know it, more simply, as the South Sea Company. The plan, orchestrated by a cunning financier named John Blunt, was a mirror image of John Law's scheme. The company would take over a large chunk of the national debt. In exchange for their government bonds, people would be given shares in the South Sea Company. The government was thrilled. It could lower the interest rate it paid on its debt. The public was intrigued. Why? Because of the story. This was the displacement. The company had been granted a monopoly on all British trade with the Spanish colonies in South America. The narrative painted by the company's directors was one of unlimited riches. They spoke of the legendary gold and silver mines of Peru and Mexico. They whispered of entire fleets of galleons, laden with treasure, just waiting to be traded for simple British woolens. A key part of the deal was the Asiento de Negros, a contract to supply Spanish America with African slaves, which was considered an enormously profitable enterprise at the time. The story was that the profits from this exclusive trade would be so vast that the company's shares would be the most valuable investment on earth. Now, a polite historian might point out a few minor flaws in this business plan. Firstly, Britain and Spain were at war for a good portion of this period, meaning all trade was, to put it mildly, suspended. Secondly, even when they weren't at war, Spain was not exactly keen on letting its arch-rival have free rein in its colonial markets. The trade that did occur was minimal, subject to high taxes and restrictions. Over its entire history, the South Sea Company sent only a handful of ships to the Americas. The vast empire-building trade that justified its stock price was a complete fiction. The company's real business was not trade with the South Sea, it was financial engineering with the British national debt. It was a debt management scheme dressed up in the exotic clothes of a colonial trading empire. But in 1720, nobody cared about the details. John Law's Mississippi bubble was reaching its peak across the Channel, and the British were gripped by a competitive, speculative fever. The boom began. The price of South Sea stock, which had been trading at around £120, began to climb. To fuel the frenzy, the company directors, led by Blunt, started lending money to people for the specific purpose of buying more of their own stock. It was the same toxic feedback loop we saw in France. The euphoria phase in Britain was centred on a place called Exchange Alley in London. It was a chaotic warren of coffee houses and taverns, where brokers and investors gathered to trade shares. The air was thick with rumours, tips, and the heady scent of easy money. The success of the South Sea Company spawned hundreds of imitators, known as bubble companies. These were startups raising money for the most ludicrous of ventures. There was a company to build a giant wheel for perpetual motion, a company for the transmutation of quicksilver into a malleable fine metal, a company for importing jackasses from Spain, and most famously of all, a company that was advertised as being for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. The promoter opened his office at 9 a.m, took in £2,000 in deposits by noon, and then promptly vanished forever. This was the absolute peak of the mania. Everyone was in on it. All classes of society, from the Prince of Wales down to the humblest servants, were gambling in stocks. Even Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientific mind of his age and master of the Royal Mint, got swept up in it. He invested early, made a handsome profit, and sold his shares, but he then watched with agony as the price continued to soar, and his friends got even richer. Unable to bear it, he jumped back in at the top of the market, investing a huge sum. It was a decision that would lead him to his famous, bitter conclusion: I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. The distress stage began, ironically, because of the South Sea Company's own success, worried about the hundreds of dodgy bubble companies that were competing for investors' money. The company's directors lobbied Parliament to pass the Bubble Act. This act made it illegal to form a public company without a royal charter. The idea was to clear the field of competitors, but it had the unintended effect of making people scrutinise all companies more closely, including the South Sea Company itself. The government began to prosecute some of the illegal bubbles, which created a general sense of panic and a rush for liquidity. People started selling shares in all companies to cover their losses. The panic hit in late summer of 1720. The insiders at the South Sea Company, including John Blunt and his cronies, saw the writing on the wall and began to sell their own shares at the peak. As the price started to fall, the public, which had borrowed heavily to buy those very shares, was ruined. The price of South Sea stock collapsed from a high of over £1,000, back down to just over 100. Thousands of families were wiped out. Sir Isaac Newton lost a fortune, the equivalent of millions of pounds today. The aftermath was brutal. The public was enraged not just at their losses, but at the clear evidence of fraud and corruption among the company directors and the politicians they had bribed. There were riots in the streets. A full parliamentary inquiry was launched. The company's directors were arrested. Their estates were confiscated to compensate the victims, and several prominent politicians were disgraced. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was even sent to the Tower of London. It was a very British meltdown, orderly, legalistic, and utterly devastating. The South Sea bubble, like its French and Dutch predecessors, taught another generation the painful lesson that a compelling story is no substitute for actual value. For nearly 200 years after that, it seemed the world might have learned its lesson. There were manias and panics, of course, in railways, in land, but nothing on the grand, nation-captivating scale of the first three great bubbles. The fever seemed to be dormant, waiting. It needed a new kind of displacement, a technology so profound, so reality-altering, that it could justify a whole new level of "this time is different" thinking. It needed the internet. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s was a bubble of a different flavour, but with the same essential ingredients. The displacement was the birth of the World Wide Web, and its arrival in ordinary homes. It was a genuine paradigm shift. It was going to change everything: how we shopped, how we communicated, how we worked, how we lived. And the narrative that grew around it was that in this new economy, the old rules of business no longer applied. The new story went something like this. Profits don't matter. Earnings are an outdated metric from the industrial age. What matters now are eyeballs, mindshare, and growth. The goal was not to build a sustainable, profitable business, but to get big, fast. The strategy was to attract as many users as possible, as quickly as possible, and figure out how to make money from them later. Maybe. This was the beginning of the boom. Venture capitalists poured billions of dollars into any company with a plausible-sounding idea and a name that ended in com. The public could get in on the action through initial public offerings, or IPOs, and for a few years it seemed like a magic money machine, a company with no product, no revenue, and a business plan sketched on a napkin could go public, and its stock price would double, triple, or even quadruple on the first day of trading. It was financial alchemy for the digital age. The euphoria was everywhere. It was in the Super Bowl ads for companies that had never turned a dime in profit, like Pets.com and its charmingly expensive sock puppet mascot. It was in the lavish launch parties in Silicon Valley. It was in the 25-year-old CEOs in jeans and t-shirts ringing the opening bell at the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars on paper. It was the Rue Quincampoix and Exchange Alley all over again. But this time the coffee houses were online message boards and chat rooms, and the brokers were discount online trading platforms that promised to democratize investing for everyone. Everyone was a stock market genius again. Taxi drivers were giving stock tips. The fear of missing out was immense. You had to be in tech stocks. If you weren't, you were a dinosaur, a fool who just didn't get it. The absurdity reached levels that would have made the promoters of the South Sea bubble blush. Companies were valued not on their assets or their income, but on metrics that were essentially meaningless. Webvan, an online grocery delivery service, raised hundreds of millions of dollars and spent it building massive high-tech warehouses and buying a fleet of custom vans. It was a logistical marvel that managed to lose a fortune on every single order it delivered. Boo.com, a high-fashion online retailer, burned through over $100 million in less than a year on slick marketing, and a website so complex that most people's dial-up modems couldn't even load it. These companies weren't just unprofitable. Their business models were fundamentally fatally flawed, but for a while it didn't matter. The story was everything. The distress stage began in early 2000. A few institutional investors and the old-school value investors who had been mocked for years started pointing out that the emperor had no clothes. They started selling. The US Federal Reserve began to raise interest rates, making it harder for cash-burning startups to get the funding they needed to survive. The flow of easy money started to dry up. The panic, when it came, was called the dot bomb. It was a slow-motion crash that lasted for over 2 years. The Nasdaq index, which was full of these tech companies, fell by nearly 80% from its peak. One by one, the high-flying dot-coms went bankrupt. Pets.com, Webvan, Boo.com. They all disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a few funny memories and a lot of worthless stock certificates. Trillions of dollars of paper wealth vanished into thin air. A generation of investors who thought the internet was a one-way ticket to riches was completely wiped out. But the aftermath of the dot-com bubble was different from the ones before. The key difference was that the underlying displacement, the internet, was real. It truly was a revolutionary technology. The Mississippi Company was selling a fantasy swamp. The South Sea Company was selling phantom trade. The dot-com bubble, for all its excess, was built on a real and world-changing foundation. The crash was a painful but necessary correction. It cleared away the froth, the unsustainable business models, and the outright frauds, and what was left behind were the companies that had real substance. Companies like Amazon, which survived a near-death experience, and Google, which was founded right in the middle of the mania. The tulip bulb, in this analogy, actually did change the world. The speculators just got the timing and the price catastrophically wrong. And that brings us, gently, to our own time, to the present moment. We've seen a mania for a flower, a mania for a swamp, a mania for phantom trade, a mania for digital eyeballs. What could possibly be left? What new asset could be so different, so revolutionary, that it could power another round of this time is different thinking? How about an asset that doesn't physically exist at all? An asset that is nothing more than an idea, a string of code secured by a shared decentralized ledger. How about cryptocurrency? The displacement for this latest chapter in our story was the 2008 global financial crisis. That event created a deep and lasting distrust in the traditional banking system, in governments, and in the centralized control of money. It was into this environment of suspicion that an anonymous figure named Satoshi Nakamoto released a white paper describing a new invention, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It was a currency with no central bank, no government, no CEO. Its transactions were recorded on a public ledger called the blockchain, maintained by a global network of computers. The narrative that grew around it was perhaps the most powerful of all. This wasn't just a new asset, it was a revolution. It was the democratization of finance. It was digital gold, a safe haven from the inflation and manipulation of government-issued currencies. It was the separation of money and state. It was the future. The story was complex, technical, anti-establishment, and for its true believers, it took on an almost religious fervor. The boom was slow at first, confined to a small community of cryptographers and tech enthusiasts. But as the price of a single Bitcoin rose from pennies to dollars, then to hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of dollars, the world began to take notice. The stories began to circulate, tales of people who had bought a few $100s worth on a whim in the early days and were now multi-millionaires. The euphoria phase of the crypto bubble has been a multi-year roller coaster. It has seen the creation of thousands of other altcoins, each with its own story and community. It gave us the ICO initial coin offering craze of 2017, a Wild West echo of the South Sea bubble's absurd startups. And it gave us NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. This was the moment the bubble reached a level of abstraction that was almost poetic. People were paying hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars, not for a physical object, but for a unique token on a blockchain that pointed to a digital file of a piece of art, often a cartoon of an ape, or a pixelated punk. An NFT of a Semper Augustus tulip would have been the perfect self-referential pinnacle of the whole affair. The taverns of Amsterdam, the Rue Quincampoix, Exchange Alley, the online message boards of the 90s, they have all been replaced by Twitter, Discord servers, and Telegram channels. The mania is now global, instantaneous, and operates 24/7. The fear of missing out, or FOMO, is more intense than ever, amplified by the constant stream of social media. The psychology is the same, just supercharged by modern technology. The distress and panic stages have also played out, multiple times. The crypto world has its own term for a crash, a crypto winter. We have seen prices fall by 80 to 90% on several occasions, wiping out fortunes and exposing frauds and poorly run companies. Each crash is followed by a period of revulsion, where the mainstream declares the whole experiment dead, and yet the underlying technology of the blockchain, much like the internet, continues to develop, and the story, the belief in a decentralized future, persists, ready to fuel the next boom. We are living inside this chapter. There is no neat conclusion, no clear aftermath to analyze from a safe historical distance. Is it a bubble on the scale of Tulip Mania? Is it a technological revolution on the scale of the internet? Is it somehow both at the same time? The question is left for us to ponder. And so, as we drift back through time, away from the flickering screens of our modern world, past the wreckage of the dot-coms, past the angry mobs in London and Paris, we find ourselves back in a quiet Dutch garden in the spring of 1637. The noise has faded, the promises of infinite wealth have turned to dust, the contracts are worthless, and a tulip, a simple beautiful flower, pushes its way through the soil. The echoes of its story are a quiet reminder. They show us that technology changes, the assets change, the language changes, but the underlying engine remains remarkably, stubbornly, the same. It is the human heart, with its twin chambers of greed and fear. It is our love of a good story. It is our deep-seated need to believe that this time, this one time, we have found the secret, the shortcut, the magical bulb that will grow into a fortune. The enduring lesson of the tulips is not really about finance or economics. It's about us. It's not that we are foolish, necessarily, but that we are, at our core, hopeful creatures. We are wired to believe in the promise of a rare and beautiful thing, And as long as that remains true, the five-act play will always be waiting in the wings for its next performance. The fever will always be there, dormant in our collective bloodstream, waiting for a new flower to capture our imagination and begin the dance all over again. And in that predictable, recurring rhythm of human nature, there is a strange and perhaps a soothing kind of sense. The story repeats, a gentle, familiar cycle, turning and turning, as the world quietly falls asleep.